African time.
In South Africa. My name, of course, Vuwani. This show is always live and it's broadcast from our studios right here in Auckland Park. Between 9 and 12 every weekday morning, we're also live on YouTube, which means you can watch us on demand anywhere in the world at your leisure. We ask a question today. Of course, we've been dealing with the burning of schools that's caused a lot of consternation here in South Africa the last week. We ask you this question: how do we restore peace and stability in the Vuwani district in Limpopo? Of course, schooling severely disrupted. More than 20 schools have been torched and more than 20 arrests, we can tell you, have now been made. But to get the latest on that story and others, let's go to Elvis.
Thank you, Eben. Let's take it right from the top. Over 20 people are expected to appear in the Malumulele Magistrates Court in Limpopo today in connection with violent protests at Vuwani. The Constitutional Court will this morning hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, against an electoral court decision. And the search is continuing for a mother and her 4-year-old child who was swept away by floodwaters at Chatsworth in Durban. Those are all the stories coming up, but before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Markomate what's happening on the sports front. A very good morning to you, Kendall.
Elvis, good morning. Good morning, Eben, and good morning to you at home as well. It's been a humdinger of a weekend, and this is what we've got for you in the sports today.
Brilliant stuff. The South African does it again, extends his championship lead. And are you looking...
South Africa's Brad Binder is on a blinder as he makes it 2 race wins in a row in the Moto3 World Championship. And Polokwane City frustrates SuperSport United, holding them to a 2-2 draw in Attridgeville.
For just the second time in his career.
And Novak Djokovic defeats world number 2 Andy Murray in Madrid in 3 epic sets to grab his 29th career ATP World Tour Masters title. All that and more we've got for you at about 10:20 or so, but back to the main desk for the news.
Thank you, Kendall. The Constitutional Court will this morning hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission against an electoral court decision. This is our top story. The Electoral Court ruled that the voters' roll must contain addresses. The IEC had previously warned that the decision could have catastrophic consequences for South Africa. The Electoral Court found that by-elections in the Clockwo municipality could not go ahead unless addresses were supplied. The IEC says it needs time to remedy the problem. The governing ANC supports the IEC's application. The official opposition is against the appeal but says that the IEC should only be allowed to run the municipal by-elections on the contested roll. The city of Kigali in Rwanda has opened its doors to the world. From Wednesday until Friday this week, more than 1,500 delegates are expected to attend the conference. Now, this is an important occasion for Rwanda to show off the progress it has made since 1994. This is the year that the terrible genocide that claimed more than 800 lives took place over 100 days. Today, the country boasts economic growth of over 6% and an impressive IT infrastructure. Our reporter Diabo Setu is in Kigali in Rwanda, and she's covering the World Economic Forum there. Diabo, very good morning to you and welcome. Diabo, can you hear me?
Good morning.
Yeah. So you're in Kigali this morning. Tell us a little bit about the country and given the history of the country, taking a look back on that terrible genocide that happened many years ago.
Absolutely, Elvis. Well, when we speak of Rwanda, obviously everyone remembers the genocide that took place here in 1994 that claimed lots of lives, just under 1 million or over 800,000 lives that were claimed here. It's a momentous occasion for Rwanda to be hosting the World Economic Forum soon after South Africa that hosted it last year. This country has made progressive strides, Elvis. They've made sure that the economic growth is quite enviable. If you ask me, it's more than 5%. They pride themselves in digital transformation, and their infrastructure, their IT infrastructure is quite enviable. Everywhere you go here, Wi-Fi network is readily available. Internet is very, very cheap. And it's an important time for Rwanda to be hosting this, to show off to the world that, you know, even after the genocide and even after what it's known for, it can still host a world-class conference. As you said in the intro, 1,500 people are expected to be attending the conference here in Kigali. The important thing that I have noted the minute I arrived here, Elvis, was that this is probably one of the cleanest countries in Africa. It is immaculate. It's very clean, not a scrap of paper on the floor. We are coming from the CBD, and as I speak to you, there is nothing that suggests that this place is not clean. It's being kept immaculate. The gardens are beautiful. There are actually very big restrictions on plastic use. You remember that we back home tax plastic use, and we use it a lot to carry our groceries and so forth. But there, on the other hand, it's not allowed. Once you get to the airport, they ask you if you've got a plastic. If you do have a plastic, they shred it up. It's not allowed into the country. Another important thing are the visa regulations that they've championed. It's one of the countries where you come here, you only do the visa upon arrival. You don't have to go to the embassy in your respective country to apply for a visa. So this is quite big strides that this country has made. Talking about economic growth also, you'd be pleased to know that the 1 or 3 key drivers that drive the Rwandan economy would be the tourism sector. They pride themselves in their services sector, the mineral sector. They don't depend on this like in other countries such as South Africa that are highly dependent on mineral use. And also the agriculture farming, particularly tea and coffee farming. They are the champions of tea and coffee farming, as with other East African countries. So it's quite interesting. When I spoke to you earlier on about the country being as clean as it is, there's a day once a month in this country called Umuganda. This is where everyone, it's also, let's call it a community service day. Everyone comes together and they clean up. This includes the president himself, Honorable Kigali, Rwandan president. He comes here and cleans with the country, with the citizens, to keep this country clean. You'll just see next to me, it says keep Kigali clean. So they really, really pride themselves in making sure that everything is going well and it's very, very clean.
Now Diabo sounds fantastic, and I mean, I look at the pictures there behind you, but how are the preparations ahead of the World Economic Forum on Wednesday?
The preparations are going very well, Elvis. The conference itself is going to be held at Camp Kigali. This is a former military base here in town where all these delegates are going to be happening. As I drove in yesterday, I noticed that there's a lot of construction happening here. They're building their own, an equivalent of a convention center. Not far from my left, I can also see a lot of construction happening. Visitors are very well received. Accommodation is readily available. It's very full, of course, but it's very, very clean. The people are welcoming. So it promises to be quite a momentous occasion. And of course, SABC will be bringing you updates each and every day on how that is going.
Diabo Setu, thank you so much for that report. That's our reporter on the scene, Diabo Setu, in Rwanda. Now, back home, at least 21 people are expected to appear in the Malamulela Magistrates Court in Limpopo today in connection with violent protests at Vuwani. 20 of the schools have been burned down in the protest. Residents went on the rampage after the court upheld a demarcation decision that their area should be incorporated into a new municipality.
back in the troubled areas around Vuwani to quell tempers and to douse fires. And some hope after meeting traditional leaders for 2 hours.
Irrespective of the position you hold in this community, whether you're a politician, whether you're a traditional leader, whether you're a business person, if you commit acts that are constituted by our own laws, that these are criminal activities, whether there's intimidation, arson, wanton destruction of property, we should be able to act on that one.
The invitation has been extended to all traditional leaders, and it came to our attention that not all traditional leaders were present in this meeting. And we have undertaken together with the traditional authority of Kanganani that we will be, of course, engaging all traditional leaders.
We're going to establish a task team which will liaise with other, relevant stakeholders to come with a solution which will bring, the shutdown to an end.
The clergy has also weighed in on the Vuwani saga.
And this beauty, that is South Africa, this beauty queen that is our land, cannot be spoiled by anything, not even tribalism.
Those arrested for arson and vandalism will appear in court on Monday.
They will be facing several charges, public violence related, arson, malicious damage to property, and more charges may be added.
Police deployments have been stepped up amid a looming shutdown. The State Security Minister had strong words for those behind the destabilization of Vuwani and surrounding areas. He says whether the shutdown continues or not, police will start removing barricades from the road. Janji Chauke, SABC News, Kabungeni, Limpopo.
And of course, we're staying with the story and we're asking you that very important question as to the stability and security in Vuwani. How do we restore that as a nation and as a society and as a community in Vuwani? How do we restore peace and stability there? Let me know on the Facebook page as well as on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom. You can let us know what's on your mind and we'll read your comments during the course of the program as to what you have to say about it. Now, there's a number of things happening currently. We'll speak to our reporter Janji Chauke in a short while to give us an update as to what is currently happening. There's also some analysis on the situation in Vuwani. So we're looking at all these issues that is currently taking place in Vuwani to make sure that we get all the angles covered. Now, it's not yet clear if residents of Vuwani will resume their protest action this week. That was after suspending it on Friday. 24 schools and other buildings were torched by residents in protest against the Demarcation Board's decision to incorporate their area into a new municipality. Now, to look into the historical aspects of the Vuwani and Malamulele area, we are joined on the line by a gentleman that was an IEC employee during the first local government elections in the area in 2000 and 2001, and also an advisor to the Premier of Limpopo on social cohesion, Dr. Simon Ndoye. Doctor, very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning to you and to the viewers.
Now, Doctor, you were there during the formation of the first local municipality in the area. How would you describe the situation then, and what is different now?
Thank you very much. I think the whole situation of the kind of tribalism that is there, which is also the kind of something that is actually steering the whole unrest. I have observed that during the time when I was municipal electoral officer in 2000, because before the first municipal elections, there were arrangements for the local governments in the interim. And I think those who were there during that time were sensitive to the fact that these communities have been separated for a long time after 1967. So with the Homeland Citizenship Act, now they were sensitive to those names of municipalities. You would get a municipality in the interim called Thoyando Malamulele, local municipality. You would have Livu Bushingwezi. So those are two names of the Venda and the Sutu, the Tonga areas where people were staying. Now, they were sensitive, but I think there was no follow-up by a process to those arrangements in the interim, because those who started really meant very well about it. So from 1994 up to the first local government elections, they had those arrangements. But in 2000, that municipality, which includes the Venda and the Tonga-speaking tribes, became known as Thohoyandou, dropping off the name of Malamulele. So that, I think, became a very sore point, because the Malamulele residents, who have known their area as some kind of a self-regulatory place, because it fell under the Gazankulu Bantustan then, so they had local people and people who were delivering services. All of a sudden, because of the new dispensation, they were disadvantaged again, and that caused a lot of strife in the area, and they started protesting. When they protested, those protests were acknowledged so much that the next round of elections, the municipality was now changed to Thulamela, and Thulamela was a seat of government in the now Kruger National Park in the east, where both the Tonga and the Venda people stayed together in harmony. But those people who stayed in 1910, those people who stayed in Thulamela, those who stayed in the Venda and the Tonga area before 1967, those people are no longer alive. And the Homeland Citizenship Act pressured people to live according to their language. And in the people of Lamulele, I remember very well when I had an area manager who would then bring the results slip from that area, and he withheld them and put them into a box containing ballot papers that were cast, and he knew that one's not supposed to be opened. That was their way of protesting, to say we don't want this area to be belonging to that municipality.
Yes.
And we raised these issues with the leadership and the political leaders then.
Doctor,
but
we haven't got much time, Doctor, but how do you think can this situation be resolved?
Well, the situation can be resolved in two ways. The kind of approach that is now, legal, it cannot solve this problem. I think, as the Venda King has said, that he would approach the president, because in my view, this is the problem that was created by the president himself when he was, trapped into an outcry for a municipality and based on tribal lines, and he gave in to that pressure. He put a political, an emotional, and a historical answer by putting a political statement when he gave the people their municipality. And they use the same tactics as these ones in Vuwani, but we really condemn the destruction of property. But I think that has been said that if you want to be led by this government, you must destroy property. That's when they will actually react. Yes, I think in Vuwani also it was like that. Because last week on Wednesday, 9 schools were banned before the government came in, before anyone came in. And when the 20th building or the 90th school is banned, that's when the government begins to react and put things together. So I think we need I think we also need a commission of inquiry that must actually, be set to investigate these things, or, to put things in there. Because if you correct people the way in which I see now, which government is doing, and arrogant again. I mean, I heard the Minister of Culture this morning.
Yes.
It's arrogant again. This arrogance is not going to assist the people of Vuwani and the Malamulele.
Unfortunately, that's where we got to leave it. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Simon Ndoy. He was an IEC employee during the first local government elections in the area and also an advisor to the Premier of Limpopo on social cohesion. But it's now over to Eben for more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Abbas. Of course, we'll get back to that team. We'll be live in Vuwani shortly just to kind of get an update what the people are saying there this morning. But yesterday was an important day for us here in South Africa. It marked exactly 20 years since the adoption of South Africa's constitution. The adoption of the constitution, well, considered was a turning point in our history. The constitution is the embodiment of a vision that South Africa belonged to all, for non-racialism and for human rights. Now, to talk to us about 20 years of the Constitution, we are joined in studio this morning by Lwando Kaso, a former Constitutional Court law clerk. Very good morning to you, Lwando. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Hi.
Let's reflect on 20 years of the Constitution. Have we managed to use the Constitution as a tool to overcome the injustices of the past?
I think we have, but at the same time, I would really caution us being too dependent on the law for social change, overburdening the law for social change. So I think there have been signal achievements. There are a number of constitutional court judgments that we can go through that have alleviated the plight of many of those who are vulnerable in our society. So I think we are much better off now with the Constitution than we were before. So if you look at things like social and economic rights, if you look at even things like moral citizenship that the Constitution affords us, it says that we are bearers of constitutional rights. We're not just legal subjects. That gives us some sense of dignity and belonging in the space that we're in and affirming us as people.
Now, this day also coincided, of course, with the most iconic speeches ever made, the I'm an African speech of President Thabo Mbeki. Just reflect on that and then how this ties into the discussion that we're having now.
Yes, what an exceptional speech for an exceptional occasion, I mean, a historic occasion. And I think the challenging thing about the I Am an African speech is that it goes through our history, both good and bad. And also it says a lot about identity and being African. It's not just about your race that makes you African. It's about your residence. If you live here and you're committed to the cause, then you have every right to make that affirmation and that claim that you are an African. I mean, part of the speech he talks about in his blood courses the blood of the Malay slaves and saying he's part of the European immigrants who found a home here in our native land.
Yeah.
So it's about recognizing myself in you and you recognizing yourself in me. And it's hard to be prejudiced if you recognize yourself in other people who consider themselves Africans. So that's the value I take from the speech. It gives a sense of identity and also it marks that great occasion and celebrates what we achieved then.
As an individual, a member of society, a good citizen, how do we contribute to the protection and the promotion of our Constitution?
First, I would say a simple task of people owning one and having their own copy of the Constitution, actually reading the Constitution and understanding what it says, because if you go on someone else's interpretation of the Constitution, that may be problematic. As we know with the property clause, a lot of people read it a certain way and will tell other people that it says something that it actually doesn't say. So I think the first step is actually know what the document says. And then the second step would be teach others what the document says and also try and see it as an opportunity rather than a stumbling block, because a lot of people have painted it as a document that stays in a stumbling block for transformation, which it's not, in my opinion. So it's sort of engaging it in terms of a social revolution and using other avenues rather than the courts in order to achieve whatever your purpose is as a movement.
Now, we've got this wonderful Constitution and the one thing that South Africans understand are the right spot of the Constitution. These are my rights. Do we have a handle on responsibilities as South Africans? And if not, how do we get there?
I don't think we do, especially when part of that is giving up power. So part of the obligation is saying that my rights may have to be limited for a greater purpose, such as equality. And I think a lot of people need to do some reflection and grappling in terms of that. If you're going to be part of this society, it may need for you to give up something. and some sort of selflessness is required if we're going to take this country forward. So I think just being self-reflective and being willing to give up some measure of your power for the greater good would be a good place to start to understanding obligations. 20
years ago, I would have been told that I'm a crazy idealist for believing in that, but that's what we're fighting for. In conclusion, if we have to look at where South Africa is now, we've gone through difficult scenarios, difficult times, we've got race scenarios. How do we use the Constitution as the key tool in uniting us?
I think if we look at the preamble, it paints a picture of the kind of society that we want. I think that was our collective pact years ago. It needs some refreshing. People need to go back to that preamble and also ask if they're willing to commit to that vision. And if they are, then you're supposed to participate in the ways that the Constitution calls us to participate, especially with equality and if you treat other people as your equal and you disabuse yourself of the prejudice that you have, I think it would make for a much better society right now.
Luanda, thank you for joining us. That's very refreshing to hear these words come out of the mouth of a young South African. It really gives me a lot of hope. I thank you for joining us today. Former Constitutional Court Law Clerk Luanda Gaso joining us here in studio this morning on Newsroom. Of course, we're reflecting 20 years ago, former President Thabo Mbeki delivered one of the iconic speeches of our time. I'm an African. Let's take a look.
I am an African. I owe my being to the hills and the valleys, the mountains and the glades, the rivers, the deserts, the trees, the flowers, the seas, and the ever-changing seasons that define the face of our native land. My body has frozen in our frosts and in our latter-day snows. It has thawed in the warmth of our sunshine and melted in the heat of the midday sun. The crack and the rumble of the summer thunders, lashed by startling lightning, have been a cause both of trembling and of hope. The fragrances of nature have been as pleasant to us as the sight of the wild blooms of the citizens of the veld. The dramatic shapes of the Dragon's Back, the soil-colored waters of the Likwa, Iqeli, Notugel, and the sands of the Kalahari have all been panels of the set on the natural stage on which we act out the foolish deeds of the theater of the day.
I'm an African. It was a defining moment in our democracy. The national campaign, #IamConstitution, well, it's made a stopover in Durban on its countrywide awareness drive to celebrate the Constitution. The Constitution was passed 20 years ago on the 8th of May. A small group of campaigners braved rain and cooler temperatures around the beachfront to make their voices heard. They were joined by the Durban Refugee Social Services, which believes the Constitution also provides for all refugees. The I'm Constitution road trip aims to get South Africans to talk about the country's Constitution. Campaigners seek to promote the values as well as the benefits. Well, time for us now to move on and take a look at what is happening on social media on this Monday morning. We'll start off by recapping some of the top trends today and over the weekend. These graphs are sponsored by, put forward by Roy Africa. Of course, President Jacob Zuma once again dominated the charts, followed by the EFF during the week. But by Sunday, that was late yesterday, Mother's Day had taken over the charts. Now, another big entry, of course, is Ria Piacha and the ongoing Marikana inquiry. Then, on the international front, the new mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, was one of the biggest entries after the usual front-runner politicians. Then, in today's trends, of course, hashtag Thabo Mbeki, his powerful I'm an African speech that we just discussed is making the rounds, highlighting 20 years of the Constitution. Then a little bit of controversy around hashtag Mabel Jansen. Now, the High Court in Pretoria, the judge is the latest to be called out on social media for alleged racist commentary or comments. That one will be seen. Hashtag Thuli Madonsela also in the news, of course, allegedly received a tip-off that she had been marked as a target of a hit. Someone trying to kill me. There you see the picture. Then, the video of the day. Let's take a look. This one comes from Chad Stardison at Firefighters First and shows the wildfire in Fort McMurray in Canada that may double in size over time. The devastation is simply immense, as you see. Acres upon acres of burnt, razed to the ground, really. Farmland, motor vehicles, and the like. Creates a rather shocking picture. Hashtag Vuwani, of course. Our reporter in Njanji Chowke is on the story. We'll be crossing to Njanji shortly to get an update. What the people are saying in Vuwani. Of course, there's a court case, or not a court case, so much an appearance of young people. Of course, Etlokwe is in the news. We expect some sort of ruling today. Of course, there's also the hashtag floods going on in KwaZulu-Natal. And I can tell you that a mother and her child well, they've been washed away and the bodies haven't been recovered yet. That's very much in the news. Let's now take a look at our picture of the day. This one comes from @Pompier Paris, and it says, solidarity to the forest fire evacuees and the 1,100 firefighters in action in Alberta, Canada. And I can tell you the pictures that you saw a little bit earlier. Have a look at this. This is as people are starting to lose their property in that fire in Canada. Let's take a look at our comment of the day. Of course, brought to you by Roy Africa. Comes from Inari Potter at Zanicat School, and it says, not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. And that is, of course, in reference to Mother's Day yesterday. I trust that all the mothers around the world were treated with the love and respect required on this very day. Of course, our top story, or our focus today, at least 21 people, or even more than that, were expected in the Malamulele Magistrates Court in Limpopo today in connection with violent protests there. More than 20 schools in that Limpopo town have been torched by, allegedly by residents protesting against the incorporation of Vuwani into a new municipality, which will include Malamulele as well. These are some of the pictures coming out of there. Now, let's take a look at some of the... Before we go there, let's take a look at some of our comments coming in. Very concerned, of course, people are with regards to students and education and scholars not being in school and the like. Let's have a look at some of the comments. Tsepo says, to the kids at Vuwani, don't give up. The road is not easy, but you'll get there. Just disappointed at the parents who burn the kids' school. Yes, Tsepo, that is very much a sentiment shared around the country. Can someone declare a state of emergency in Vuwani, please? Ask the Queen of Sheba. Then Snapchat says, Tandikile says, I feel sorry for the kids in Vuwani who now don't have a school to go to because they were burnt. All 60,000 learners, she says. This one from Time Kong says, people of Vuwani, what is your reason for not wanting to be in the new municipality? Now, we've heard some of the issues coming through. Pretty much unhappiness. Yeah, some of the pictures coming out over the weekend there. You see one of the school buildings razed to the ground. No schooling will be done in there for the foreseeable future. Oh, yeah, as you see pictures that, that you are putting forward on social media. We're trying to bring you some of the images coming out of the Limpopo. Yes, lots of discussions going on. Of course, today, the courthouse in Malamulele will be very busy with more than 20 people expected to appear there. Let's take a quick look at the front pages. Front pages from around the globe. We'll start in Europe The Times reports that David Cameron will today raise the spectre of war if Britain votes to exit the European Union, as he asked whether leaving is a risk worth taking. Then in the United States, the USA Today says ride-sharing services Uber and Lyft plan to suspend service indefinitely today in Austin after voters in the Texas tech hub failed to adopt a ballot measure that would have allowed them greater self-regulation. Then finally in Israel, Jerusalem Post, the trial for the soldier who shot a Palestinian in Hebron in March after he was already wounded and lying motionless on the ground is underway in the Jaffa military court today. Let's take a quick roundup around our courts here in South Africa. Now, we start in Malamalele, of course, where 21 people are expected to appear in the Magistrates Court in Limpopo today in connection with violent protests at Vuwani. At least 24 schools have been burnt in these protests. Then here in Johannesburg, Czech fugitive Radovan Krejcir, yes, he and his co-accused are expected in the High Court in connection with the murder of Lebanese national Sam Issa in 2013. Krejcir is already serving a 35-year prison sentence for kidnapping, attempted murder and a drug-related offence in a different case. Still here in Joburg, we go to Tlokwe. The Constitutional Court will this morning hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission against an Electoral Court decision. The Electoral Court ruled that the voters' roll must contain addresses, and that could cause a whole lot of consternation in this election year. Anyhow, we'll take a short break. You're watching Newsroom here on SABC News.
How does this extreme heat affect basic conditions of living?
Food spoils more readily, and the risk of food poisoning outbreaks or food poisoning in a household.
Should we experience another heat wave soon, and it's coming?
First sign is always thirst. Thirst is a sign that already your body started to be dehydrated, and that's a very early sign that most people will be able to sort of pay attention to and then act on. That doesn't warrant any serious medical attention. But the minute that you start to feel slightly nauseous, that you start to feel dizzy, that's a sign that you need to stop what you're doing, get out of the sun, get into a cool area, slow down your intensity, get hydrated, cool down.
Join Dr. Sello Mutawung every Saturday from 9 till 10 in the morning.
Now, the Limpopo government says it has made what it calls a powerful breakthrough in negotiations with the majority of traditional leaders in the area surrounding Vuwani. The provincial government says it hopes that these successful talks will now see an end to a week of violence, with more than 20 schools being either torched or vandalized by protesters. Now, for more on the story, we joined from our Polokwane studio by the Limpopo government spokesperson, Puti Slobo. Mr. Slobo, very good morning to you and welcome.
Good morning.
First and foremost, tell us about the talks and how did it go, and you indicate that it's a breakthrough.
Yes, we were fortunate. We met the traditional leaders in the area of Hlanganane. If you can recall, the tribal or territorial space that we're talking about has all in all about 18 traditional space. So in that area where we were yesterday, we have affected 13 traditional leaders, and all of them, were anonymous to agree with us to say we need to end violence, we need to allow learners to go to school, and that we need to cooperate with the police, ensuring that those who are found on the other side of the law are actually dealt with. And the fact that you have such a commitment, you have people who are saying, we understand there might be issues in relation to the incorporation into the new municipality, but we don't think the way the things are going, the vandalization of properties, intimidation of people, burning of schools, they totally rejected that situation, and And that is what gave us hope.
Mm-hmm. What is the current situation in Vuwani? People have stopped protesting now?
Yes, you have the upper side of Vuwani, the areas closer to Tando, which are areas around Masia, Mashao. Those are areas where at the moment we have challenges in terms of roads being barricaded, big stones being put there, and some degree of intimidation, including the burning down of schools. But we'll be engaging. Remember, we have got 5 traditional leaders that are left on the other side that will be engaging early this week. And we're optimistic that once we engage with them, because we had a discussion with them together with the king, when the king made a call to say he doesn't support violent protest. Much as he might support protest, he has got issues with violence.
What are the people of Mulamulela or Vuwani unhappy with?
You know, there is a portion that is unhappy with the integration into the new municipality. The challenge is that it seems there are people who were spreading propaganda that is the Malamulele municipality, which is not true. The people of Malamulele applied for their own municipality. The application was not successful. They went to court. They lost in court. But there was a request by the Minister of Cooperative Governance to asking the demarcation board to do some determination. And the determination that happened, it doesn't mean the municipality is Malamulele. It doesn't also mean the people will be relocating. It's the new entity, as we are calling it in the province, that includes certain parts which were falling under the then Mutale municipality and those that were falling into the Makhado municipality. So it's an integration. It affords them an opportunity to integrate. Remember, much as people are talking tribalism, you have the situation where the Venda-speaking people and the Tsonga-speaking people in the area have been living together in peace and in harmony, and you also have intertribal marriages there. So what is manifesting now is something that is drawing us back, and there is a commitment from all of them to say, we are not tribalistic. We can't start throwing tribal issues on the table. We've been living together. We're committed to live together. The only thing is now that they've shown an understanding in terms of the new entity that is a municipality that together they have to sit down and give it a name that is acceptable to all of them.
So are you suggesting then that all this trouble is about a name?
The trouble is about people who have issues in terms of the fear of what we call the fear of the unknown. Because, you know, some people are saying they are comfortable in Makhado, but they can't explain to you properly what is that make them feel uncomfortable with the new municipality. With the new municipality, which is actually not even Malamulele, which is not even Makhado. Because we as government, we believe that now that the Municipal Demarcation Board, an entity that we have no control over, has made a determination, they've gone to court, they've lost, and we're saying to them, please, let's understand, you have shown confidence in the courts, you have shown confidence in the legal system. Why, if you still have other issues, are you not proceeding with the same approach that you have adopted and withdraw from violence? Because ourselves as government were saying, we can't tolerate violence. We can't tolerate destructions of public property. We can't tolerate a situation where people are destroying the future of both the current and the future generations.
But if people are not happy with integration, are you then engaging them in terms of their grievances to make this go away? And what about the 24 schools that has been burnt? Will children be able to go to school soon?
Our approach is that the children must go to school. The issue, because the people who have got dissatisfaction, those that we met yesterday, are agreeing in terms of incorporation into the new municipality. And those, fortunately, are the traditional leaders whose areas are actually not even very far from Makhado, but a bit distant from Malamulele. But they are willing to be incorporated. They understand the whole issue of the new entity. but they're also concerned about the future of their children. Hence, we are saying those on the other side, a bit closer to Malamulele, will be engaging with them to say, you might lodge your appeal, but allow the young people to go to school. Let's guard, in terms of development, it's very essential that much as we might have issues, much as we might be dissatisfied, in terms of development, let's protect the little that we have rather than destroying it, because in terms of development, that is costing us, that is taking us very back, and I don't think there is anyone who has got an energy to go back. Even yesterday, the leaders in the area were saying, we don't have any energy to go back. Those who want to go back, let them go back alone. And we're taking that message to the leadership of the people in Vuwani, in the Vuwani area, to say, please, if you are unhappy, go and appeal there at court. But as you are appealing, allow everyone to continue with normal life, particularly the young children. Remember the area of Vembe, in terms of the matric results. It has been a platinum zone for us. I mean, they made us to shine, they made the whole country to shine in terms of the quality of results that they've been producing. But to have a situation where people have burned down about 24 schools, it will never be acceptable anywhere in the world.
Mr. Sloba, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
That is Pudi Saloba. He is Limpopo's government spokesperson on the line to us. Remember that we're asking you that question as well. Of course, in relation to Vuwani, and how do we bring peace and stability back to Vuwani? You can let us know what's on your mind on the Twitter handle as well as on the Facebook page. But right now, it's over to Eamon for more.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elvis. Of course, one of the stories we find in the news this morning is around Judge Mabel Jansen. No relation, I have to point out to all of you there at home, in case you're thinking this is that kind of thing. It's not. Now, she found herself in a social media storm after posting a message with alleged racial undertones suggesting that rape is part of black people's culture. This was, of course, an ongoing social media storm that's very much in the news. Let's take a look at some of the comments with regards to that, well, social media storm. I don't know what you call it anymore. This one from Enrico Klopper. And here, South Africa, what is going on? South Africa likes a good Twitter war, Enrico. We like to fight and call people out. Grant says, side issue, is there not some sort of policy rules within the JSC that regulates judges' use of social media? No, you have to regulate yourself. Quinton Jala says, last week it was Matt Tennyson, a double master's graduate who just happens to be a racist. Today it's Judge Mabel Jansen. Now, Quinton, before we jump the gun, Judge Mabel Jansen has not been found guilty of anything, nor did she call out anyone by name. But there's an ongoing fight with her and some lady that goes by the surname Skitter that we'll see play out over the next couple of days here in South Africa. Mabel Jansen, how do you go to the media and say the comment was taken out of context? You shouldn't have made those comments at first. It was a radio enthusiast talks about. Now imagine scores of young black men sentenced convicted by Mabel Jansen in the past, owing to this school of thought. I weep, says Ree. Yes, every story has context. Let's wait for the context before we jump the gun and, well, assume that people are guilty of one or the other thing. It's very easy to hide behind your phone and spew that kind of hatred. We should always wait until the facts emerge, and let's wait in this case. Now, let's go to our Facebook page. Deputy Minister of Transport, Siniziwe Chigunga, says negotiations are ongoing regarding calls by toll users and other stakeholders to decrease tariffs at the Swartrugens tollgate in the northwest. Then, police say a primary school at Stintwater near Hammanskraal, north of Pretoria, was torched yesterday when a political gathering turned violent. Police say Marotola Primary School's windows were smashed and the school building set alight. That is so sad. Finally, China's stocks tumbled again earlier this morning, reaching an 8-month low as investors saw hopes for a strong economic recovery fade and were worried about fresh regulatory curbs against speculation. All of that and more on that page. That's Newsroom. Time now for another break. When we come back, we'll be live in Polokwane for an update, hopefully from Njanje Chake, but we'll definitely have a political analyst who lives in the area and is right on top of the story. So, don't go away.
technology isn't all scary. There's also fun stuff like gaming.
Lots of women do play games, whether it's on their phones or their tablets.
Then there are Africans who are using new tools to make other people's lives much easier.
We typed the whole CV on a small, QWERTY Nokia phone.
For all these and other technology and social media news, join me, Spumelele Zondi, every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Central African Time on SABC News.
Welcome back. All protest activities pertaining to the demarcation dispute were suspended over the weekend in Vuwani to allow residents to continue with their normal duties like burials, weddings and even other activities. Violence erupted in Vuwani after the Limpopo High Court dismissed the community's application not to allow the establishment of a new municipality there. The community want the area to go back to Makado. Now, political analyst Elvis Masocha joins us from our studio in Polokwane this morning to give us analysis on what really is happening in Vuwani. A very good morning to you, Elvis. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning to you, Ivan, and my best to all the viewers.
Give us your take on this situation in Vuwani. What's going on? You live there, you know.
You know, Ivan, it is a greatly worrisome and turbulent, situation that has got, dire ramifications on the integrity and sustenance of our own country. Because, a banning of a school, even one school, is not only unholy, but it's terribly criminal. Because schools are institutions and places of academic worship. There's no any society on earth that tolerates banning of schools. But at the same time, we need to interrogate the underlying societal complexes that might be precipitating that. I suspect that, there is this, excessively strong anti-school attitude that is prevalent among some South Africans, not necessarily confined to Vuwani. You find people who have got a strong negative attitude towards schools and schooling. That make it easy for them to can even think of banning schools, because if we ban a school, what happens to the collective wisdom of a nation? What happens to the dreams and aspirations of ordinary children? Thousands of children are now stranded, frustrated. They don't know what is going to happen to their future in Vuwani. So it is a greatly worrisome societal problem.
Obviously, we heard from the Limpopo government a little bit earlier. Their spokesman, he told us, well, they think it's as simple thing as people being afraid of what could be new under this municipality. Is it as simple as that, or is there a tribal element within it, as is speculated in the media around the country?
Here we are dealing with the repetition of historical blunder. Remember 2 or 3 years ago, in 2013 and 2014, the Malamulele community residents were on a rampage, banning and destroying public property, including schools, saying that they want their own local municipality. They don't want to belong to the Thulamela municipality. Remember, Malamulele is a predominantly Tsonga-speaking community. At the time, they didn't want to belong to the Thulamela municipality because some of them viewed Thulamela municipality as predominantly Venda. That's why during the time, there were some protesters in Malamulele who were saying, we don't want to be led by those vendors, referring to the people in Thulamela municipality. So now we are seeing a repetition of historical blunder. The very same Vuwani people, some of them are saying, we don't want to share, this new municipality with those Tsonga-speaking Malamulele people. So it is a manifestation of a neoconservative Bantustan tribalism that we are seeing among some South Africans. Remember, since 1994, successes and strides were recorded in terms of creating harmony and peace between different ethnic groups and racial groups. But it's disturbing that there are some individuals who still see fellow citizens as Pedi, Tsonga, Zulu, or Venda. That is very much worrisome and is taking our country backward.
Elvis, before we finish, just tell me quickly the role of the king. Tony Ramabulani. Now, this weekend, he says he supports the residents of Vuwani in this struggle, but he condemns the acts of public violence and destruction. How do you view that?
You know, there is no one on earth, not only in South Africa, who must tolerate the torching or burning of schools. We must never create any freedom or right for people to be free to burn schools. We must strongly identify and isolate individuals who want to destroy our centers of academic learning. There is no any leader in South Africa who must even justify the actions of those people who banned 24 schools. Because those 24 schools did not exclusively belong to Vuwani. They are the treasures of this country. They are the historical treasures of our country. In schools, we derive wisdom, enlightenment, and sophistication. We must never create any space for any individuals to can threaten to ban schools. I think we must be intolerant of any individual in the country who is threatening to ban schools. I think that is an attitude all of us in South Africa we must adopt. We must never create excuses for those people who ban schools. It was totally wrong, immoral, and criminal. I think as South Africans, we must condemn that. No one must defend those individuals.
Thank you very much, Jarvis. The country has condemned it. Around the country, I think all stakeholders are condemning this kind of behavior of taking an opportunity of learning away from young people because you are unhappy with whatever that dispute may be. We've asked you the question a little bit earlier. Let's take a look at some of the live tweets before we go to the top of the hour. That was our question. How do we restore peace and stability in Vuwani? Here are some of the tweets coming in this morning. Unati Fruit Boom says, SABC Newsroom, in all of this mess is happening, kids will lose most of their school time. That's the sad bit, Unati. Unfortunately, the victims are the young people in the area. This one from Ntieni says, SABC Newsroom, the hunt should start with senior politicians and leaders of the march to find the exact instigator of this. Of course, yes, more arrests are expected. Unati again, he says, our municipalities don't do their work as to where it's supposed to do. Residents cry every time about services. That one from Unati. Lekasa says, I really appreciate what Vuwanians are doing because without damaging any property, you will never be heard like ZB. You can never burn anything, Lekasa. You only set yourself and your own communities back, my friend. That's the one thing we have to learn. We cannot take opportunities away from other people because we are unhappy. Anyhow, that's where we leave it for this hour. You're watching Newsroom. We'll be back with a complete news update at 10 o'clock. That's in 3 minutes' time, so don't go away.
They are basically arresting him, continue to arrest him on behalf of the apartheid government.
We are dealing with effects. We are not dealing with the causes. And for as long as we deal with effects, we are never going to solve this problem.
What do these people need in prison? Why are they there? The PAC, as Dr. Pegu is saying, has been seeking answers, and they're not coming.
What kind of answers are you getting?
I really think I've answered that question.
I think it's a difficult question. I don't have an answer for it. How was it possible that they could operate with such impunity?
The only thing you want is closure.
The only thing we want is closure. And unfortunately, I don't really have sympathy for the idea that if you're too old, you shouldn't stand trial.
That's Rights and Recourse with Dumile Mateza, every Sunday at 2 p.m. Central African Time, only on the SABC News channel.
One other person has been shot dead and another is in a critical condition in hospital.
The CRL has laid charges against controversial televangelist Paseka Mutsoneng.
More than 1.3 million South Africans have been added in the past 2 registration weekends.
The International Monetary Fund warns that policy uncertainty could dampen economic growth in South Africa.
And all eyes are on the new Bok coach, Alistair Coetzee, his challenge to keep everyone in the country happy.
News to Today provide news updates giving a wealth of knowledge. Breaking stories and crossing live for you. We follow business developments intensely. Experts and analysts tackle all challenging issues for you. We cover stories locally and abroad to keep you informed. We cover all sporting codes just for you. We are sure to give you weather to be ready for the day. Stay tuned to News Today at 3 p.m. from Monday to Friday on SABC News.
Monday, the 9th of May, 2016. This is Newsroom on SABC News, Channel 404. If you've just joined us, Jumbo Africa, and a very warm welcome as we broadcast live from our Auckland Park studios here in Johannesburg to the rest of the African continent. I'm Elvis Preslin.
And I'm Renee Vest, and we'll be with you until 12 o'clock today. We're also streaming live on YouTube with the entire show available on our YouTube channel. Of course, today we are asking you, how do we restore peace and stability in Vuwani? Of course, you've been following the story, lots of protests there.
Well, you can let us know what's on your mind on the Twitter handle at SABC Newsroom. You can also let us know on the Facebook page. If you like us there, you become part and parcel of the Informed. But before we go any further, let's take a look at your news headlines. Over 20 people are expected to appear in the Malamulele Magistrates Court in Limpopo today in connection with violent protests at Vuwani. The Constitutional Court this morning will hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, against an electoral court decision. And the search is on and continuing for a mother and her 4-year-old child who were swept away by flood waters at Chatsworth in Durban. They are presumed to have drowned. Now, those are all your headlines, but before we get to the news, let's find out from Kendall Makamate what's happening on the sports front. A very good morning once again, Kendall.
Good morning to both of you, and good morning to everybody at home as well. It's been a very massive weekend on the sports front, and before I get ahead of myself, this is what we've got for you today.
Brilliant stuff. The South African does it again, extends his championship lead, and
South Africa's Brad Binder is on a blinder as he makes it 2 race wins in a row in the Moto3 World Championship. This as Polokwane City frustrates SuperSport United, holding them to a 2-2 draw in Atteridgeville.
For just the second time in his career.
Novak Djokovic defeats world number 2 Andy Murray in Madrid in 3 epic sets to grab his 29th career ATP World Tour Masters title. Now, all that and more we've got for you at about 10:20 or so. I'll be sure to stick around for that. Now, back to Renee Vest, who's got your news.
Thank you very much, Kendall. The Constitutional Court will this morning hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission against an electoral court decision. The Electoral Court ruled that the voters must contain addresses. The IEC had previously warned that the decision could have catastrophic consequences for South Africa. The Electoral Court found that by-elections in the Tlokwe municipality could not go ahead unless addresses were supplied. The IEC says it needs time to remedy the problem. The governing ANC supports the IEC's application, but the official opposition is against the appeal and says the IEC should only be allowed to run the municipal elections on the contested roll. The national campaign I Am Constitution has made a stopover in Durban on its countrywide awareness drive to celebrate the Constitution. The Constitution was passed 20 years ago on the 8th of May. The small groups of campaigners braved rain and cooler temperatures on the beachfront to make their voices heard. They were joined by the Durban Refugee Social Services, which believes the Constitution also provides for all refugees. The I Am Constitution road trip aims to get South Africans to talk about the Constitution. Campaigners seek to promote the values and benefits of the Constitution. Meanwhile, South African luminaries, including former President Thabo Mbeki, have celebrated the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Constitution in 1996. During the commemoration held in Pretoria yesterday, Mbeki reiterated its call for a national dialogue to reflect on the Constitution.
The former president also used the occasion to reflect on criminality, which has resulted in the destruction of schools, libraries and trains.
It's illegal to ban schools. It's illegal to go and ban libraries and ban trains and all of this banning that takes place. I don't think it requires any new law. The law needs to be enforced. It signifies a certain collapse, a collapse of order.
He said while the new constitution was a milestone in the struggle of democracy, South Africa must engage in a national dialogue if it wants to move forward.
There's a lot of restlessness in the country. A lot of disaffection about the situation. I think quite understandably.
His sentiments were echoed by others.
The other thing I want to say about corruption is that we are not the worst in the world. Now, that's not a wonderful thing to say, but we are better than many a country in the world in terms of our value system.
The panelists agreed that the Constitution must be defended, but South Africans must not despair as the future is bright. Muntlengeni Dipoku, SABC News, Pretoria.
Now, the Constitutional Court will this morning hear an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission, the IEC, against the Electoral Court decision. The Electoral Court ruled that the voters' roll must contain addresses. Let's now join the proceedings from the Concourt, where an urgent application by the Independent Electoral Commission against an Electoral Court decision is being heard. The IEC had previously warned that that decision could have catastrophic consequences for South Africa when the Electoral Court ruled that the voters' roll must contain the addresses of all the voters on the roll. Now, the Electoral Court found that the by-elections in the Tlokwe municipality could not go ahead unless those addresses were supplied. The IEC said at that point in time that it needs time to remedy the problem. The governing ANC supports the IEC's application, but the official opposition is against the appeal and says that the IEC should only be allowed to run the municipal elections on the contested roll. Now, these are the two arguments that we'll hear this morning from the Concourt live in Braamfontein as they prepare to set forth this judgment. So stay tuned as the Concourt hear the voters' roll or the addresses on the voters' roll. Let's see if we have that link now up and running. It seems like the judges are coming through.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Thank you, Mr. Bossman. Thank you, Mr. Marcus. Thank you, Mr. Kass. Thank you, Mr. Skakani.
Justices, I am here for the IMP with my friends, Jonathan Jones and Vera Sen.
Thank you too, Mr. Kemp. Thank you, Mr. Tokota. Mr. Turnbull, I assume there is no waiver. Is it a fair assessment?
No, I think I should, because I am going to deal at the outset with what I think is the most important part of the case.
Yes.
And for that reason, would welcome the court's questions.
Oh, from the word-go?
Indeed.
Thank you.
I propose to address four main topics. The first is the law, and on that score, the IEC's position on four issues of law. I will secondly deal with this court's judgment in Cum's case, its ratio and its implications. In the third place, with the electoral court's judgment in this case, submit that it was wrong on the core issue. And I may tell you that on this score, my learned friend, Mr. Marcus, will deal with a subsidiary aspect of that judgment. And I will deal in the fourth place with the alternative application for direct access and alternative relief. On this score, too, I will address merely the relief sought by the IEC, and I won't deal with the other proposals made by the other parties, because my learned friend, Mr. Sikakani, will address that in his address, and my learned friend, Ms. Blizzard, will deal with it in reply if needs be. So I start with the first chapter on the issues of law. And for that purpose, we have prepared a brief statement of the IEC's position on four aspects of law. I have distributed amongst my learned friends, and I wonder if I might hand it up to the court. It doesn't constitute submissions, it is merely the bottom line, the conclusion on each of four issues of law. If I might be given leave to hand it up to the court and then speak to it. There's one for the judges and for the clerk.
You may proceed in the meantime, Mr. Turnbull.
The first proposition of law is this. It is that we accept that the IEC may only register voters in the voting districts in which they are ordinarily resident. And for that purpose, the IEC must obtain from the voter seeking registration the voter's address, if she has one, or the voter's enough particulars of the voter's ordinary place of residence to determine in which voting district it falls. The IEC is not required to verify that information, but it is the IEC's duty, once having obtained that information, to ensure that the voter is registered in the voting district in which her ordinary place of residence falls.
While you are there, did you say we may interrupt or not interrupt?
No, certainly, Chief Justice.
All right. What then would be available for a person that the determination that certain voters belong to a particular district is correct? What would that South African have to look at to satisfy himself or herself that the conclusion arrived at by the IEC is the correct one?
Chief Justice,
I'm not saying what the IEC does is wrong. I'm just saying, in the event of a challenge, what are we going to compare what to what?
Well, we submit that anybody who challenges the roll would have to show that the voter is not resident in the district in which they are, for which they are registered. There is a second issue that you raised, Chief Justice, and that's this. What record must the IEC keep of the address of the voter? And I think that is what you are interested in.
Not because the law requires it, but just to play it safe.
Indeed.
Yeah.
That is indeed the issue that we address. That's the second point of law that we address in our note. If I may refer to it. We say that the question is, must the IEC record the address? In other words, keep it and record it in its system. We say the following. Firstly, Section 8.1 requires the IEC to make the requisite entries in the voters' roll. Regulation 10 says that the entries that must be made are only the ID number, the name and ID number of the voter. Therefore, the IEC was not required by law to record the addresses of the voters at least until December 2003, when Sections 16.3 and 16.4 were introduced. When they were introduced, they didn't say that the IEC must now keep addresses, but we accept that it probably implies that the IEC must henceforth keep those addresses.
Can I interrupt again? Does it imply or does it require of the IEC to do that? I ask the question because Section 16, subsection 3 provides for political parties, and I assume by extension independent candidates, it may be a subject matter of debate, to have access to a national voters' roll that has in it physical addresses. How then would that be possible if it were open to the IEC to choose not to reflect the physical addresses?
We approach this case on the basis that Section 16.3, in other words, the section to which you refer, does imply that it should keep and record those addresses. So that 16.3 and 4 introduced that requirement by implication, but it only did so in December 2003. As at that date, there was already 18 million voters on the voters' roll. And that's really where the heart of this case lies.
Well, that's interesting. Here's another difficulty. What if from 2003 that was not done? What are we to do then? And are you in a position to say from 2003, in other words, after Section 16, subsection 3 were passed, that was done? And if it wasn't, what should be the implications of that?
And my understanding of the evidence is that it was generally done, but the evidence is ambivalent in the erudition with which it was done. It was certainly not done as a rule until December 2003. It was generally done from December 2003, because you'll remember that at the time that this case arose, there were no longer 18 million voters without addresses. There were 16 million voters without addresses. In other words, all the new or most of the new registrations and even some of the old registrations brought that number down from 18 to 16. But I can't assure you that it was fastidiously done from December 2003.
Are you in a position to say what percentage of registrations that took place ever since the amendment kicked into operation were compliant, so to speak?
I don't think so, Chief Justice. But frankly, that is simply because the case against the IEC has never been one that said that you have failed in your duty since 2003. The case against the IEC has consistently been, and I'm getting to it now, but has consistently been that what you were required to do was not only henceforth to record addresses, but to go back to the 18 million and find and record their addresses. And that's really where the dispute between us lies. The essence of the case against the IEC is that it should have gone back and found the addresses of the 18 million, or at least those of them who have addresses. That is the case, and you will see in the electoral court, in this particular case, the heart of the cause of action against the IEC was that there were 4,000 people on the roll without addresses. And the case made against the IEC was there ought not to be people on the roll without addresses, because you ought to have gone out and found addresses for them.
Well, that I understand, Mr. Trengove, except for one thing. If it was the IEC's position that the proposition that we should have gone further, in other words, covered the period before 2003, is incorrect. The correct position, according to our understanding, is that we were only under some implied obligation, or whichever way the IEC chose to put it, to reflect the addresses after 2003. Ought not the IEC then to have said, in line with our understanding, or the understanding of our mandate, this is what we have done to comply since 2003, or with the advent of the CAM decision?
Yes. Chief Justice, may I come back to that issue in greater detail when I deal with the Electoral Court's judgment in this case? Because that, with respect, was not the basis on which the cause of action against the IEC was formulated, or the case was developed. The case against the IEC was there are 4,000 names on the roll without addresses. And that means those people are illegally on the roll, because you ought to have found addresses for all of them. So the question was not, the attack against the IEC did not make that distinction between before December 2003 and after 2003. It was a general proposition that nobody ought to be on the roll without an address.
Are you sure we shouldn't give you 10 minutes just to make your case before we interrupt you? You still maintain that position?
Maybe what I should do is just take you through the propositions of law.
I think so.
Mr. Trengove, on the exchange that you've been having with the Chief Justice.
He wants to take us through the...
oh, okay.
Yes.
I'm interested in the table, if you can also have regard to the table that appears at page 421 of the record.
Just to manage it, Mr. Trengove, just do what you were minded to do, and signify when you're comfortable that we may interrupt.
Chief Justice.
Thank you.
As you'll see from this note of ours, the first proposition is that we accept that the IEC has always been obliged on registration to make sure that the voter's address or description of their place of residence falls within the voting district in which they are registered. And with respect, the IEC says, and there is no serious challenge to that evidence, that it has, as a general rule, always fulfilled that duty. That evidence is quoted in our heads from page 8 in paragraphs 21 and 22. So it is uncontroversial that the IEC was always under a duty to make sure that an applicant for registration is registered in the right voting district. About that issue, there is no debate. And there is no serious challenge to its evidence that it has always complied with that duty. There have, of course, been mistakes and there have been lapses. But as a general policy, it has always complied with that duty. The second question that we address is, was it obliged then to keep record that address. And that is where there is a difference between the parties, because we submit, for the reasons we set out in our paragraph 2, that there was no duty on the IEC to keep those addresses on record after registration has occurred. If there is such a duty, then it is one that was introduced by implication by Section 16.3 in December 2003. And we're going to argue the case on the assumption that 16.3 did introduce such a requirement, but only did so in December 2003. And then, of course, the cum judgment in this case, of this court, recognized that duty, and in paragraph 5C explicitly requires the IEC now to keep addresses. But I emphasize that paragraph 5C makes it quite clear, firstly, that it is a prospective duty imposed on the IEC, only from the date of judgment, that's from the 30th of November last year, and the duty imposed on it is a duty to keep the address on registration. In other words, it is quite inconsistent with the case made for the respondents that Section 16.3 imposed a duty not only to keep addresses on registration, but imposed a duty on the IEC to go back to find the addresses of the 18 million already on the roll in December 2003. So that is as far as the duty to keep those addresses. And we emphasize that neither Section 16.3 nor this Court's judgment in cum, nor paragraph 5C of cum, said or implied that there is a duty to go back and find addresses for voters already on the roll. There is simply no such legal obligation imposed on the IEC. And that is why we say in our paragraph 3 of our note that the absence of a voter's address on the roll does not imply or even suggest that the voter's registration is invalid. And that is, there are two categories of voter on the roll without addresses, but perfectly validly registered. The one category is people registered before December 2003 because their addresses weren't kept and put on the roll, and despite the fact that their registration was valid. The second category would be those registered since December 2003 who don't have addresses, who were registered on the basis of a description of their place of residence, but who do not have a convenient address that you can put into the roll. So that the mere fact that there are names on the roll without addresses does not imply or even suggest that their original registration was in some way irregular or flawed. And that is the case against the IEC, that there were 4,000 names on the roll without addresses and therefore the roll is defective. We submit that there is a flaw in that reasoning because a name on the roll without an address does not imply irregular registration. And the most vivid illustration of it is that two of the independents, that's the second respondent, Ms. Kaba, and the third respondent, Mr. Seleke, they are two examples of exactly what we're talking about. People who were lawfully registered before the IEC kept record of the addresses, but to this day are on the roll without addresses. And when that point was made in the founding affidavit, if I may just give you the reference, but the reference was at page 405 in paragraph 43.4. But the interesting part is the response to it, which you'll find at page 556 in paragraph 78.5, where the answer is filed on behalf of the respondents. And in response to this statement in the founding affidavit that two of the independents are examples of people who are lawfully registered but don't have addresses on the roll, the response is in paragraph 78.5, I further submit that the second and third respondents will confirm in their supporting affidavits that, 1, They have been residing at their current addresses for many years. 2, they have supplied their addresses to the Commission when they registered. 3, the addresses are street addresses that are perfectly verifiable. 4, their addresses do not fall without the category of places in rural areas where verification of addresses is not possible. 5, that both of them have a cell phone and a bank account. 6, that by virtue of the above, their names will appear on various national databases. And then 6 again, I therefore categorically deny that the only means of correcting the voters' roll would have been an exercise of simply removing voters, etc. So what they said is that we accept those people who are perfectly validly registered, but their addresses aren't there. But the case made against the IEC is that you had a duty to go out and find addresses of people of that kind. And then the argument they make here is to say, I was perfectly contactable. I had a cell phone, I had a bank account. Your duty to find the addresses of 18 million people included a duty to find me, and you could and should have found us. Well, that's a different...
Mr. Trengo, may I just ask if you're going to deal with Mr. Marcus's argument on behalf of the ANC that part of the CUM order applied because of the apparent shenanigans in relation to the Tlokwe by-elections, and therefore that there was a duty at least to find addresses of voters in the by-elections who didn't have addresses?
Yes, in the heart of the CUM case was proven, accepted, irregular registration of 1,040 voters, 25% of the registration since 2000. So that the CUM order must be understood to be in the first place an order about 1,040 proven irregular registrations. And so on that score we accept that interpretation, but precisely because that case was concerned not merely with names without addresses, but concerned about proven irregularity.
Just let me know if it's time to interrupt you. I was just allowing you to round up before we could put questions to you.
Well, can I deal with the last issue of law, which is the fourth issue, and that is, we've now said the IEC were initially not required to keep the addresses, became required to do so since 2003, but there was no duty to go back to find the addresses of people already on the roll. There is then the fourth and last question, and that is it obliged to include those addresses in the voters' roll made available to the public, the political parties, and the independent candidates? And with respect, there are 3 sets of provisions which deal with that issue, and we deal with them in our paragraph 4, because the 3 sets of provisions deal with 3 different occasions on which voters' rolls are made public, and the rules that govern them differ. There is firstly section 16(1) and 2. They require the IEC to make the ongoing voters' roll available to anybody at any time on request, either for inspection or a copy at the prescribed price. So that is concerned simply with the ongoing voters' roll, which is made available to anybody at any time on request. And we submit with respect that voters' roll is one that does not include any addresses, because it contrasts with 3 and 4, which does provide for the inclusion of addresses in the voters' roll. 16(3) and 4 operate at the time of national or provincial elections. And what they say, they were the provisions introduced in December 2003, what they say is that at a time of national or provincial elections, the voters' roll must be made available to the political parties, including the addresses of the voters. But it then, at the same time, because it specifies that on this occasion addresses of voters must be included, it introduces safeguards of the privacy of the people whose addresses are now made public. It says that this This voters' roll may only be made available to political parties contesting the election, and those political parties may only use the voters' roll for the purposes of the election. And it reinforces that limitation by a serious criminal sanction, so that it is clear that when Parliament decided on this occasion and for this purpose to make addresses available to outsiders, it is confined to this particular occasion to political parties for purposes of fighting the election, subject to a privacy restriction.
Ready to be interrupted?
Indeed.
Or do you still want to be protected from us?
There. I'm just about there, Justice.
You're about ready. Let me just go back to the point that the Chief Justice raised with you quite early. From December 2003, did the IEC have a duty to record voters' addresses?
We accept that they did, yes. Let me say, the duty, if there was one, is implied by 16.3, and it is not open and shut and clear that it does imply
implied?
such a duty. But
the section tells us that you provide political parties with addresses.
We're available, yes.
Which means you have to keep them so that you can supply them.
We accept that there there is an implied duty to keep the addresses.
So aside from us in CAM, Parliament tells all of us that the IEC must keep addresses of voters in the voters' roll and make these available to political parties. It's a clear duty that Parliament sets, not us.
Indeed. That's the effect of 16.3 and 4.
Let's go somewhere else to your note. In 4.3 of the note you gave us this morning, the note suggests that Section 6.2b of the Municipal Electoral Act envisages a voter's roll without addresses.
Yes.
What is the justification for that proposition?
Well, we make the same submission, Deputy Chief Justice, about 16.1 and 2 on the one hand, that's in our paragraph 4.1, and about 6.2b of the Municipal Act on the other, simply because none of them say, well, let me first say, they predate December 2003, so that they existed at a time when there were no addresses kept, or no duty to keep addresses.
But we know that the definition of voters' roll in the Local Government Municipal Electoral Act means the national common voters' roll. So we have the duty introduced in December 2003, and the municipal electoral law tells us that talks about a roll, and 6.2b in particular makes such segments available for inspection. And also 1 says the segments of the existing roll, but we know we have a definition of roll. It refers to the normal national roll.
No, with respect, we don't have a definition of the national voters' roll. The Section 8.1 of the Electoral Act says that the entries made, that the requisite entries must be made on the voters' roll. That's all we know about.
Referring to the definition of voters' roll in the Municipal Electoral Act.
Yes.
It tells us it's the same roll as the national roll, common voters' roll.
Yes.
And we know now that we're talking about the same roll,
yes,
whether for local or provincial or national elections. Does the duty in 16.3 then extend to municipal elections?
Yeah, well, there's a misunderstanding between us, Deputy Chief Justice.
Yes.
The misunderstanding is this. I accept entirely that elections at both levels of government, or all 3 levels of government, are conducted on the same voters' roll. The question is, what does that voters' roll include? it certainly did not include addresses before December 2003.
Okay, let's debate that also. Why not?
Well,
the law says that you will determine where a voter lives.
Yes.
And IC tells us we have determined that without fail, but we did not always keep the records. Why? Why not?
Well, firstly because there is nothing that had required the IEC to keep the addresses and put them in the roll. And the two provisions which do speak to the content of the roll.
So once they determine the addresses, what do? Do they destroy them?
They kept them, but in the course of time, a lot of them had gone missing. And they also make the point that very often the addresses on those forms were inadequate, so that when the voter came with inadequate information, they would sit down with an electoral officer who would question them and by question and answer determine where they lived, and on that basis registered them. So the records were both, some of them were inadequate and a lot of them went lost.
And the Chief Justice asked you after the amendment, did the IEC in December 2003 keep the record of the addresses?
Yes, it did. I can't tell you that it did so fastidiously and carefully because there was no great emphasis on it and the issue isn't squarely addressed in the papers.
Does that include descriptions of where voters lived?
I don't understand that it ever included in the roll the narrative of descriptions of where voters lived. No.
No, but when they inquire where a voter lives, the voter would sometimes provide a description.
Yes.
Otherwise, the IC official will never be able to satisfy herself.
Always provided a description if they didn't have an address. And that is beyond doubt. They always got that information.
Yes. Now the question is, was there a recordal of that description after 2003? We've agreed already the duty exists, the statutory duty put up by Parliament. So the question is,
No. There was a duty to record addresses. If people didn't have an address, there's no duty to record the narrative that placed them within a voting district.
Then you must give address a very narrow meaning, isn't it?
Well, I
to go past that one.
I submit with respect that address is a description, an identifier of a place of residence, not a narrative which says between the two spaza shops under the water tower.
In the Kham case, what were we confronted with? How was it possible to have false registrations?
Justice, Deputy
because
Justice,
there is the mischief that the judgment sought to get at. How was that possible?
Can I perhaps just complete my answer to your earlier question? There was always, and there still is, a description of the voter's roll, because Section 8.1 says that the Electoral IEC must record the, quote, requisite particulars in the voter's roll. And Regulation 10 has always said that the particulars that must be recorded are the names and ID numbers of the voters. So the starting point is that a voter's roll is a list of names and ID numbers, not addresses. The first time that it was suggested that addresses must also be included is under sections 16(3) and 4. But they don't say you must disclose the voter's roll. They say you must disclose the voter's roll, including the addresses. And then they add to that a restriction to make sure that those addresses are not abused. It would be wholly inconsistent with that parliamentary scheme of 16(3) and 4 to read 16(1) and 2 as meaning that addresses have always been included in the voter's roll and have always been accessible to anybody on request without the restrictions imposed by 16(1) and 2. So the status quo, at least when 16(1) and 2 was introduced, was that the roll is freely available to anybody at any time, but it does not include addresses. 16.3 and 4, for the first time, required disclosure of both of a roll with the addresses, but subject to severe restriction. You asked me about the Cum case. The Cum case, indeed, Deputy Chief Justice, was a case about irregular registrations. It was proven, and the IEC investigated and accepted, that 1,040 people had been irregularly registered. And there was never a proper explanation given for that lapse. So, and that was really what Cum was about.
And if the law as set up in 2003 had been followed, would there have been room for false registrations?
No, but it had nothing to do with the law of 2003. It is common cause that the IEC has always been required to ensure that people are registered in the correct voting districts. And that had nothing to do with the law of 2003. That requirement is a requirement there from the outset and was not followed in those 1,040 cases. So that it is true that there was a lapse in Cum. That was the subject of this court's censure in Cum. But it was an aberration and not the normal practice that was followed. And an admitted aberration.
Mr. Trengove, I ask questions for you. And maybe before you go any further, and maybe also just to caution your colleagues, I hope nobody is going to suggest that any of the players, list of all the court, is trying to disenfranchise 12 million people. Indeed. I've seen that in the heads of argument coming up, because that will call for some real answers if anybody comes up with that.
Yes.
I'm just cautioning that whoever comes up with that argument must be prepared to answer. This is what I need to understand. Let us assume that this court's judgment in Cum was wrong. But it's there, it stands. What is it that the court required of the IEC to do in relation to the national voters' roll as it affects Tlokwe, for a conclusion to be arrived at that now we have a national voters' roll that complies with the court order? How far back did Cum require of the IEC to go in terms of ensuring that the addresses are reflected?
Now, with the greatest of respect, the Cum order itself said in 5C that the IEC must henceforth keep the addresses on registration. And let me just read 5C because it makes it clear, doubly clear, that that it is concerned with the future, not the past. It says, it is declared that when registering a voter to vote in a particular voting district after the date of this order, the Electoral Commission is obliged to obtain sufficient particularity of the voter's address to enable it to ensure that the voter is at the time of registration ordinarily resident, etc. And then D followed from that the roll must be made available at the time of municipal elections. But the part of 5C that I wish to emphasize is this, is that it says, it speaks about a duty at registration, at the time of registration, not a duty to go back and find addresses of people who are already registered. So it was confined to a duty to do something on registration.
Yes.
And that duty is imposed with effect from the date of the order. That's with effect from the 30th.
Let's take it in stages. Did Cum make new law or simply restate the law as it existed at the time?
5C certainly did.
Did we change anything and come up with anything new in relation to the law that governs the registration of voters?
Not the law that governs registration, no.
So it was restated?
It was restating the law. We have, as you know, Chief Justice, we have some reservation about 5D.
We'll get to that.
But
yes.
That's got nothing to do with the process of registration.
Right.
That's got to do with the form of the roll made available to people contesting elections.
So on your understanding of 5C, does it have any impact on the voters' roll that affects Tlokwe, that cost the applicants to approach the court in the first place? In other words, does the order in 5C, order 5C, require of the IEC to do anything in order to correct the national voters' roll as it affects Tlokwe, or did the court merely give direction in relation to what is to be done going forward?
We submit with the greatest of respect that what you're talking about is paragraph 5C, and 5C says you must from now on get those particulars when you register voters. It said nothing, not only is it silent on the past, but it is inconsistent with 5C to suggest that there is a duty to go back and find addresses of people who have already been lawfully registered. 5C just doesn't make sense if there were a duty of the kind that the respondents contend for.
Which part of the order addresses the concerns that caused people to approach the court in the first place, if any?
All right. I mean, what the court did in was to set aside an election already held because the roll on which it was held was admitted to be flawed. That was the guts of CUM. But as far as the orders going forward are concerned, it did not suggest that the flaws in the roll had to be cured by going back and finding addresses for the 18 million who were already on the roll in December 2003.
And what on the IEC's understanding of the CUM judgment, I'm sorry, I'm not too clear with the pronunciation, I don't mean any harm. What, according to the IEC's understanding of the CUM judgment, was required to be done to remedy the complaint that caused the independents to approach the court in the first place?
Well, the primary duty was to address the 1,040 irregularly registered voters. And the IEC explained that it did subsequently investigate all of those cases, and it removed those which were ultimately indefensible. 700 odd of them were removed from the roll. Not because they didn't have addresses, but because they were found to have been irregularly registered in the wrong voting district.
And what about the addresses? What was the understanding in relation to ensuring that addresses are reflected going forward?
Going forward, the only understanding is paragraph 5C, which says you must record them on registration. In other words, henceforth, make sure that you keep the addresses when people register. It didn't address. And it said, and in 5D it said that those addresses must be made available where available, must be disclosed where available. What the court didn't address is the 18 million who are still on the roll without addresses. That was not what CUM was about. That was the issue in the electoral court, but not in CUM.
I think I must reserve my other questions so that I don't monopolize the questioning.
May I go?
Mr. Trengo.
Before you move away from the Chief Justice's interaction with you, why is your case at all that the CUM judgment disenfranchised 15 or 18 million people.
No.
That is not your case, is it?
Why
are we dealing with that at all?
The electoral court, because that was the effect of the electoral court judgment, but not Kham judgment. No. The electoral court misunderstood Kham. But it certainly suggests that any...
Show me the part in the electoral court judgment which deals with the historic
Chief Justice, I'm going to do that.
Role.
I'm going to do that. May I deal with Kham first and then get to the electoral court judgment? Because my submission will be that they misunderstood Kham.
Yeah.
I will deal with Kham only to identify its ratio. I'm not going to read the relevant paragraphs, but may I just give you the paragraphs of Kham, which we submit with respect, capture its ratio. There are a number of them. They are paragraphs 58, 68, 72, 73, 76, 77, 80, and 92 to 94. And the ratio expressed in those paragraphs may be quite succinctly summarized, and that's this. The court set aside the election because of a combination of three flaws. The first and the main flaw was that there were 1,040 of the 3,832 registrations since 2000. So let me just repeat those numbers. New registrations were 3,832. Of those new registrations, 1,040, which constituted 27%, were incorrectly registered, and that irregularity was conceded. The second flaw was that the roll did not include any addresses, so there were no addresses in the roll at all, and that the court held was in breach of Section 16.3. The third flaw was that the roll was released late and not by the deadline required by Section 16.2 of the Municipal Electoral Act. And it was the combination of those three factors, those three flaws, which the court held rendered the election not free and fair. But it is clear, if you read these paragraphs, that the most important of those flaws was the first one, the 27% of irregularly registered voters.
Mr. Trengo, are you done on that point? Yeah. You know, I don't know about you, but I find the case to be very difficult, and I want to make the most of your benefit optimally from your collective wisdom before we go. Let me just seek clarification on this point. As we sit and stand here now, what is it that Section 16, subsection 3 requires of the IEC to have done since 2003 for the national voters' roll to be in a correct state? Let's forget a bit about what Kham said, what the Electoral Court said. As the law stands, what obligations does Section 16, subsection 3 impose on the Electoral Court? I beg your pardon, the Electoral Commission. And I'll have another question afterwards. What is it required to do?
16.3 requires the IEC to keep those addresses given to it on registration and then to disclose them to the political parties on request under 16.3.
To the extent that there is non-compliance, what is it that is required of the IEC to do so that the national voters' roll is in an acceptable state at some point, whether at the time the elections are conducted or at some other stage? What is required of the IEC?
Well, we submit that there is no evidence that the roll is flawed. In other words, there's no evidence that the IEC did not discharge that duty. What is common cause the IEC did not do is to go back to find the addresses of the 18 million already on the roll in December 2003. And that is, with respect, what this case is about. Did it have such a duty or not? We submit not.
Well, my question is slightly different. What I need to know is this. If the correct meaning of Section 16, subsection 3 is, with effect from December 2003, it was required of the IEC to reflect the addresses that were available to it from that time, so that when political parties require the national voters' roll, the addresses apparently required by Section 16.3 are reflected there. If anybody gets hold of the national voters' roll and realizes that that is not the case, I mean, anybody can just get hold of it, pay the fee, get hold of it, and tell whether there has been compliance or non-compliance. Now, if there hasn't been compliance, what is to be done?
Well, Chief Justice, the question, you speak about the addresses where available, and that's really where the difference between us lies. We accept that the IEC was required from December 2003 to keep the addresses and put them in the roll when disclosed under 16.3. But we do not accept that there was a duty to go back and find the addresses of the 18 million already on the roll. Now, and therefore, when the IEC makes a disclosure under 16.3 today, we submit that that duty is limited to those addresses which it has kept since December 2003, because they are required to be available. It does not include the old addresses of the 18 million people who were already on the roll. Our learned friends interpret 16.3 differently. They say where available doesn't mean the addresses that you have on your system. They say it means the addresses that you are able to find if you go out into the field and in search of addresses. They say that's what where available means. Now, if they are correct, then the IEC did not comply with the Act. So
I'm sorry, I interrupted. Now, you know, you're an experienced counsel, you've acted as a judge. You know, a judge never knows until he or she begins to reflect on the judgment. Indeed. What the correct position is.
Absolutely.
And that explains these many questions. But on the assumption that their interpretation of 16.3 is correct, what then should happen?
Well, that's why...
If on the assumption that there has been non-compliance, what then should happen?
If they are correct that there was a duty on the IEC to find the addresses of the 18 million, then it's clear the IEC did not comply, and then the appeal cannot succeed, and then the alternative direct access application comes into play. So, but it is as stark as that. The question is, did Section 16.3, when it was introduced in December 2003, imply not only that the IEC must henceforth keep addresses, but imply that the IEC must go back and find the addresses of the 18 million?
No, what if it implies that the IEC should have kept the addresses from 2003?
No, we accept that it implies
Except that
yes.
It implies that.
Yes.
Why are we seized with 18 million at all?
Because the case against us is that there are 4,000 people on the roll who don't have addresses and therefore are irregularly registered. We say yes. No, that logic doesn't apply.
And from that you infer that the Electoral Court meant to disenfranchise 18 million people.
Yes.
Is that where it comes from?
Well, yes. And
did it ever in its judgment deal with 18 million?
It dealt...
Or the historical voters' roll?
No.
No.
No. But what...
So you before us, because you infer from the Electoral Court judgment that it meant that IEC has a duty to correct the historic voters' roll.
Deputy Chief Justice, in fairness to the Electoral Court, may I ask to take you to the 2 paragraphs of their judgment on which we rely. They occur at page 365 of the papers, and it is paragraphs 12 and 13 of the Electoral Court judgment. And you will remember that the background was...
Which volume? Is it 4?
Sorry, volume 4.
$316 or $369?
365.
Thank you.
Paragraphs 12 and 13 of the judgment. The background was this. The independents came to court, and the core of their complaint was that there were 4,189 names on the rolls released to them without addresses. That was the cause of action. The case was there is more than 4,000 names on the roll without addresses, and that is irregular because these days all voters must have addresses. And that was the complaint that the court addressed. And it said on that score the following in paragraph 12. The fact that the voters' roll contained registered voters without addresses was common cause. Counsel for the Commission advised this court that the Commission had commenced the cleaning up of the voters' roll, but that the process had not yet been completed. This admission implies that there are indeed voters on the roll, as it was before the Constitutional Court, who should not have been included therein. It was submitted that the removal of voters from the roll would have the effect of disenfranchising them. The argument cannot be sustained. If a voter was wrongly included on the voters' roll, the removal of that voter would not disenfranchise him or her, as he or she should not have been included in the particular voters' roll in the first place. We submit with respect that logic says that where there is a name on the roll without an address, then it means that that voter was irregularly registered and that voter does not belong on the roll. Now, the court did not appreciate, probably because the facts weren't canvassed before it, that what that implied was that the 18 million who are now down to 16 million would be disenfranchised.
No, but where does it imply that? This is a specific case about specific set of facts, and the court may very well have referred to the duty that arose in 2003. And on the face of it, if there is no address, then the registration is irregular.
No,
unless the ANC uses the caveat and say IEC said there were no addresses available.
What this?
Sorry.
What this?
But you invite us to make a decision about the historical voters' roll, and I'm probing the cogency, the basis for us making that decision at all.
Well, what I'm addressing...
Why is it before us?
Well, what I'm addressing is the cause of action made by the plaintiffs in this case, by the respondents in this case. The cause of action they made was that there are 4,000 voters on the roll, on the segment of the roll, without addresses. The fact that they do not have addresses means that their registration was irregular. And the court even said, because they don't have addresses, their registration is irregular, and to remove them would not disenfranchise them because they shouldn't have been on the roll in the first place. It is that logic which is incompatible with the fact that there were 18 million people on the roll without addresses when this rule came in.
But why must we telescope the court's judgment? It deals with lack of addresses in Tlokwe, and in it we see 18 million people on the historical roll. Just help me understand, why are we seized with that particular issue?
No, what you asked...
If you say to me, in relation to the 4,000, the court was wrong to assume all of them should have had addresses, it's one argument. Quite another to say this holding endangers existing registrations on the voters' roll.
No, but with respect, we're simply meeting the case made against the IEC. And that case, if I may go back to two sentences of this court, the first and last sentences in paragraph 12. The fact that the voters' roll contained registered voters without addresses was common cause. This admission implies that there are indeed voters on the roll, as was before the Constitutional Court, who should not have been included in it. So the logic upheld by the electoral court was that any voter on the roll without an address is a voter who was irregularly registered and should not be there.
Mr. Trengov, does the court simply say, like as before the Constitutional Court, here we again have voters without addresses, and this is irregular? But why does that imply that I might be irregularly registered?
Well, because
if I don't have an address?
It misunderstands the cum judgment. The cum judgment, there were two things. Firstly, cum held, and it was conceded, that 1,040 of those registrations were wrongly registered. It had nothing to do with the absence of addresses. They were registered in the wrong voting districts. That was the primary concern in cum. The secondary concern in cum was that there were no addresses given for anybody. So that cum does not support the ratio of the electoral court, which says that when there is a voter without an address, the inevitable inference is an illegal registration and a voter that does not belong on the roll. That is this ratio, and that is the basis on which the court held against the IEC. The logic is, if there is a voter without an address, then the voter was irregularly registered and its name has come off. That was the logic of the judgment. And with respect, that logic is correct if our learned friend's case interpretation of the law is the correct one. If there was a duty on the IEC imposed in December 2003, not only going forward to keep addresses on registration, but to go back and find the addresses of the 18 million, then that logic is correct. But if you accept that there was no duty to go back and find the old addresses of people already on the roll, then this logic is flawed, because this logic doesn't allow for the fact that there were already 18 million people on the roll when the rule was introduced in December 2000.
People on the roll from 2003. And the court, there were people who were registered after December 2003, and the electoral court was entitled to infer that the voters' roll must have addresses, because that's the duty. And if there are none, on the face of it, the registration would be regular. What is wrong with that reasoning?
No. Well, what is wrong with this reasoning is it simply says a voter without an address is irregular. It doesn't say a voter without an address is irregular only if the registration took place after December 2003. It didn't inquire into the question whether these registrations occurred before or after December 2003. And what it must always accept is that there are, at least on our interpretation, and we submit on any sensible interpretation of the law and of cum, there are two categories of people who will never have addresses. The first is, or need not have addresses. The first is those at the 18 million registered before December 2003, and the other, going forward, those who do not have addresses, who merely have a description of where they live.
Mr. Trengov, can you please give me your understanding of parity of the cum judgment, and in particular the phrase that relates to the national voters' roll to be used in the ward in that election, including the addresses of all voters.
Yes.
Which voters are we talking about there? Where it says all voters.
Well, it says all voters where these addresses are available.
The pre-203.
No, we submit that means it is true that 16.3 does impose a duty on the IEC to include addresses where available, where those addresses are available. Question is, what does that mean? We submit that where available means available to the IEC, i.e. on record with the IEC. Our learned friends interpret that to mean capable of being found in the market. We submit with respect that that's a wholly unrealistic interpretation. This section, 16.3, and the court here simply followed the language of 16.3, but this section must be understood against the history of the section. Parliament knew when it was introduced in December 2003 that there's already a voter's roll. It already had 18 million people on it. We accept that it implied that you must henceforth keep those addresses on registration. And therefore it said, and then when the political parties want the roll, you must give it to them with those addresses that you have on hand, i.e. those that you have kept since December 2003. It could never have implied that you must also go back and find the addresses. And that's why they said, frankly, that's why they said where available, because they recognized that there are 18 million people for which they don't have addresses available. If they had, they could never have implied that the duty is also to find the addresses of the 18 million, because if that was so, then IEC was in breach of the law on day one, in January 2004, because nobody could conceivably have thought that it could overnight produce the addresses of everybody who has an address out there, in other words, of the 18 million. So,
Mr. Trengo, what in your view is the functional value of the provision or providing of voters' rolls with addresses?
Well, we submit that both the history and the language make that clear. That the history is, we're told, is that in 2003, in the run-up to the 2004 national and provincial elections, the political parties made representations to the IEC and said, won't you please give us the addresses because we need it for our canvassing purposes, for electioneering purposes. The two sections were then introduced in response to that request and said in their own terms that the addresses must now be given, but only to the political parties, and they may only use it for electioneering. And what must be given to them are the addresses where available. And we submit with respect that it recognized that there is already a big roll with lots of people without addresses. And all it said was, yes, we'll give you the addresses where available. We will henceforth keep them and give them to you.
As part of the functional value, can't one also add that it may, besides just canvassing, but it may also be used for purposes of actually checking the accuracy of the registration itself, because we now know that incorrect registrations happen. Chokwe tells us so. The fraudulent registrations in Ejozini, which I think in paragraph 60 of the replying affidavit the IEC admits, also tells us that this happens. So as part of the functional value, the political parties and independent candidates in the case of municipal elections may use the role to check if indeed the registrations are correct. So it's not just canvassing. Would you accept that as well?
No, with respect, Justice Malanga, we don't. For these reasons. The first is that the history tells us that the purpose was different. The second is that this duty to provide the addresses is only imposed by 16.3 and 4. And that is the duty to give the addresses after certification of the voter's roll. This other consideration, namely this other use that one may make of addresses, and that is to check the voter's roll. There is a process, and Section 15 of the Act describes that process. But there is a process before certification of the roll, where under 16.1 and 2, the roll is available to anybody at any time on request. Political parties can get it and they can check it, and then they may challenge it under Section 15, and those challenges can be adjudicated. But all of that is a process which predates certification of the roll. And the 16.3 and 4, which require the addresses to be disclosed, is the requirement that relates to the certified roll in national and provincial elections.
But surely you cannot say that what the people get given at the time of challenging, in accordance with what you refer us to, will be exactly the same as what finally gets certified.
No,
if you accept that it will not necessarily be the same, why is it then that it cannot, the roll with addresses, cannot also be used for the purpose that I put to you?
Because if you look at 16.1 and 2, that's the roll that's ordinarily available to everybody. It says nothing about addresses. And it would be highly anomalous to read an implication in 16.1 and 2 that the addresses must be disclosed to anybody who can use it for any purpose.
I'm talking about political parties and candidates only, Mr. Trango.
Justice Madlanga, we're talking about the role that is made available to everybody in the run-up to certification, in other words, before certification. That role is made available to them under 16.1 and 2. That is an access to the role by anybody at any time for any purpose, without restriction on what they may make of that information. Now, 16.1 and 2 say nothing about the addresses, and we submit that it would be anomalous to interpret 16.1 and 2 to mean that what must be made generally available also includes the addresses.
My focus is on 16.3 and the obligation in terms of 16.3, Mr. Trengov. So I don't quite see the link between that and 16.1 and 2. I don't see the link. My point was, once certified, is it not so that at a functional level, political parties and candidates may then use the certified roll to actually pick up possible inaccurate registrations? As we know that the IEC is not immune to such inaccuracies, Josini tells us so, Tokwe tells us so. Why is it that it cannot serve that functional value?
No, Justice Madlanga, you're quite correct. It can serve that purpose, and that is the way in which errors in the roll can be detected. If you ask me whether it was enacted to serve that purpose, my submission is no. But that it can serve that purpose today, that is so.
Let us. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Now let us take the point further. I would imagine that the two facets of the functional value which you now accept are not ends in themselves. Would you not accept that they actually serve the section 16, or rather 19.2 and 19.3 right to fair elections? Do they not actually enhance or add value or add content to the exercise of that right? Would you accept that or not?
Well, they certainly...
Putting it differently, if you have an inaccurate voter's roll, that may well give rise to unfair elections, CAM tells us so.
Yes.
And if you have fraudulent registrations, as happened in Josini, which the IEC accepts, again you may have unfair elections.
Yes.
And if again political parties are not given an opportunity to canvass using a voter's roll with addresses, again unfairness in the election process inheres there as well. Would you accept all of those propositions or not?
Justice Madlanga, you asked me really two questions. The one is, can those addresses be used to show up flaws in the voter's roll? And if so, is that a good thing? Yes and yes. It can, and it is a good thing.
I'm taking it further now to section 19 of the Constitution.
May I complete my answer, though? What the section, however, makes clear is that it strikes a balance between the need for addresses for electioneering. Well, let me say, it firstly says it may only be used for election purposes. It doesn't say it may be used to challenge the roll. So the purpose for which it is enacted was to allow the political parties to use the roll for election purposes, for electioneering. But secondly, the section makes it quite clear that it strikes a balance between privacy and politics and electioneering. And it imposes a strict limitation on the political parties to use it only for electioneering and not for any other purpose. So if you ask me, can it be used for other purposes, and is that a beneficial use? That may be so. But the purpose for which Parliament enacted the section was for electioneering, subject to a privacy restriction, because it recognized that the section invades the privacy of people.
Oops. I beg your pardon. Is the other reason not to ensure that the voter, upon registration, votes at the correct district? Because if he or she is voting at the wrong district,
yes,
because the address was not given as prescribed in the regulations, then it is open to the official to refuse to register.
Indeed, but Justice Nkabinde, that duty to ensure that voters are registered in the correct voting district, that is a duty imposed by Section 8.3. And that duty has always been there, and we accept that if there is a breach of that duty, then the registration is irregular. But that is a duty that exists quite independently of the two further questions. Do we have to keep the address, and do we have to give the address to political parties? Those are two subsequent questions. But you are quite right. The first and primary duty is to register people only in the correct voting district.
Look at, I beg your pardon, if you look at the founding affidavit in page 105.
Sorry, page?
Page 105.
105.
105. I think we must look first at page 95. I'm looking at the unpaginated volume. It's paragraph 6. Do you have that document? It is the annexure to the founding affidavit, which deals with the ethics and the affirmation statements.
Sorry, Justice Nkabinde, I thought you said it was the founding affidavit. Is it
the founding affidavit in this court?
Is it an annexure to the founding affidavit?
Let me just have a look at, I think it is MSM 6.
And it is page 105, I think you said.
Yes, the document starts at page, immediately after the founding affidavit, after that list of names.
Page 105.
Maybe I should just take you to the document, Mr. Trengo. It's paragraph 6. It is headed required documents. It says the following documents are required for every eligible voter to register in the correct voting district. A valid green barcoded identity document. B, correct and accurate completion of an REC1 form. C, correct and accurate completion of an RECAS form in cases where the voter does not have a formal address. Now, at 105, this document tells us what should happen if the voter does not have the address. And we know that certain voters did not provide addresses as required in terms of Section 7, read with the regulations. Now, page 105 gives us that document, which is RECAS form. It appears that this document is completed by IEC. That is, in the case where there is no address, the duty is upon IEC do what seemed to be reflected on 105. Am I correct?
Indeed, Justice Kabinde, but you must bear in mind that this form RECAS was developed after CUM in order to give effect to CUM. The IEC jacked up its processes to make sure that it complied with CUM, not only in relation to people who have addresses, but also those who don't, and give a narrative description of where they live. And that was why this form was developed, in order to register with the care that CUM required. So that is quite correct, but it is a post-CUM process.
In relation to Appendix 1 in the regulation,
yes,
was that applicable prior to CUM
Indeed.
Or after?
No. Appendix 1, the REC form, was the form that's always been prescribed. It required the address to be given, but insufficient provision was made for people who don't have addresses but merely a narrative. And that was why, after CUM, the additional form RECAS was developed to cater for those people. But you are quite correct in this sense that the requirement that the REC form be completed, that the voter's address be given, and that the registration officer satisfy themselves that the voter's address falls within the right voting district. That duty has always been there, and we accept that.
And if there are no addresses at all, it means the registering official can refuse to register.
If the voter doesn't give any address, or doesn't give an address which is sufficient to satisfy the voting officer that the address falls within the right voting district, then they can refuse registration. But Justice Nkabini, if I may just emphasize again, that goes to the requirements for registration. That doesn't speak to the two further questions. After registration, do you have to keep the address? And secondly, do you have to give it to the political parties when they ask for it under 16.3? Those are subsequent questions. But at the point of registration, you're quite correct, and that requirement has always been there.
Doesn't it follow that if the initial step is flawed, then the subsequent processes will also be flawed?
Yes, that's absolutely so. But it's common cause that the IEC has, as a matter of course, always followed the procedure of ensuring that the given address falls within the right voting district. So if you say, if that process is flawed, the registration is flawed, yes, we accept that. But that is not the case here. The case is not that at the time of the original registration, the IEC did not go through that process of satisfying itself that the given address falls within the voting district. The complaint is you didn't keep that address and you don't give me that address today. That's a different complaint. But the evidence that
Mr. Trango, you, in response to my question, you gave what I see as a very restrictive interpretation of electoral purposes in Section 16.4. Why is it that electoral purposes cannot include checking whether or not people have been registered properly? Because that actually relates to the election process. Why can't that be part of electoral purposes, or election purposes rather?
Because the process for finalizing the roll is a process catered for under Section 15, and it's a process that is undertaken before certification. I accept that you may use the addresses for a subsequent court case, as was done in this case. So I've accepted that it is possible to use that information to challenge the roll. But if you ask me, what is the purpose for which Parliament enacted this rule, then my submission is that Parliament enacted 16.3 and 4 not to allow parties to challenge the roll, but to allow parties to use the addresses in their canvassing for an election.
Thank you. I'm not sure what your answer was ultimately to my earlier question on whether what I've referred to as the functional value of the role was. I made the point that is it not so that functional role value actually goes to the question of the fairness of elections. Do you accept that or not?
No, with respect, let me just understand it correctly. Of course, it's very important that elections be fair. Of course, the role has to be accurate and reliable for elections to be fair. And if there are, and the addresses is one of the ways in which one might check whether the role is accurate. So if you ask me, can addresses be used to ensure that the role is fair and therefore to ensure a fair election?
So there was also the further part or facet or on the functional value, which is to assist you in canvassing. And if there are inaccuracies, including fraudulent registrations, that affects that. So in that context, with that context in its totality, would you accept or not that the functional value does bear relevance to the fairness of the elections?
I'm afraid I can't do better than to say addresses can be used to check the roll, and an accurate roll makes for a fair election. But what we're debating at the moment is the proper interpretation of sections 16.3 and 4. And for the proper interpretation, one looks at the purpose for which that section was enacted. And we submit with respect, the purpose for which it was enacted was not to check the roll. The purpose for which it was enacted was to accommodate the political parties' electioneering.
Let me move to my next point then on the basis of an assumption. Assuming that we were to make a holding that there is this connection, there is a connection between the fairness of the elections and what I refer to as the functional value.
Yeah.
Would you not accept that this, or rather section 190, subsection 1B of the Constitution becomes relevant? And that is the section that says that the Electoral Commission must ensure that elections are free and fair. And this is not subject to any election, or rather any legislation. This comes directly from the Constitution itself. And unlike paragraph A of subsection 1, which refers to national legislation, this is a standalone obligation on the IEC.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So based on the assumption that I say let us move from, would you accept a proposition that says the obligation on the IEC to have addresses on the voters' roll would have been an obligation that was there pre-December 2003?
No, with respect not. There is nothing in the Act or the Constitution that says you can only have a free and fair election if the addresses of the voters are given in the voters' roll. The IEC always has the duty to ensure free and fair elections, and free and fair elections can only be had on a voters' roll that is substantially accurate. But the mechanism by which one gets there, and whether you include voters' addresses in the roll or not, is not fundamental to the question whether the election is free and fair. Otherwise, you would have to hold that our elections have never been free and fair because there has never been such a voters' roll. And no suggestion in the legislation that one requires those addresses in order to have a free and fair election. At best for our opponents, one may say, addresses are nice to have because it promotes an accurate roll. but you can't for the moment suggest that it is a precondition for a free and fair election.
I thought we can turn attention to something else that just bothers me. If you could ask your Leonard Jr. to give you the Municipal Electoral Act.
Yes, I have some.
Oh, you have it.
Just look at some of its provisions available, Deputy.
I know it predates the 2003 amendment, but look at its provisions, Section 7. Parliament tells us who may vote in municipal elections. And look at 7.2.
Yes.
What should we make of that?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean. What it says is, if somebody arrives at the polling booth and their name is not on the list, but they claim to have properly registered, then there's a process which allows them to vote if they make an affidavit and satisfy the election officer that they are entitled to vote.
Yes, but 7.1 makes quite plain that you vote only in the district where you are registered.
Absolutely.
And that your name would appear in a certified segment of a voter's roll.
Yes.
For that particular voting district.
Yes.
If you claim otherwise, then you have to provide a range of things, and Parliament lists them.
No, not if you claim otherwise. If you claim that you should be on the roll, but you're not.
Yes. If you claim you should be on the roll, but you're not, then you have to provide a whole range of things.
Yes.
And significantly, this, without doubt, includes the obvious thing, the place where you ordinarily reside.
Yes.
Now, talking about functional value, isn't it quite plain in municipal elections in particular? But you can't have fair elections unless you vote in the district where you are properly registered.
Indeed. Absolutely. But
and that you determine only by determining where one is ordinarily resident.
Absolutely.
And again, that you determine by being furnished with an address where one lives.
On registration, yes.
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 But isn't that, you've debated several functional values, but isn't that the obvious functional values that we can't hold municipal elections? And that's what we are seized with here, in the Kham case, where there is no meticulous determination of where people reside.
Now, with respect, Deputy Chief Justice, one conflates two things. The first is you're absolutely right that on registration, the address must be given, and the IEC has a duty to check and ensure that that address falls within the right voting district. On that score, there is no doubt, there is no debate, and I agree that the fairness of the election depends on the proper discharge of that duty. And that was why this court held in Kham those elections were flawed, because more than 1,000 of those voters had been wrongly registered. There was an error made at the point of registration. There's a separate question. Having completed that registration, and assume for the moment, one must assume a regular registration, is there a duty to keep that address and to give the address to the political parties when they ask for it? But that is a separate question. If you haven't kept the address, you may have failed in your duty to keep the address, but it doesn't retrospectively render the registration invalid. So that, yes, it is fundamental that people be correctly registered, but no, it is not dependent on whether the address is kept and included in the roll that is disclosed. Chief Justice, I have overshot my time allocation.
Before you go, Mr. Vimpru, I just want to understand what you have given us in volume 5, which is a table that is in paragraph 66.2 in page 421 of the record.
Page 41 of the papers?
Yes.
May I just turn it up? 421.
Volume 5. Now, I think we have now established that Section 16.3 requires that any voter registration from 2003 must include the addresses of voters where they are available. And the IEC is obliged to record the addresses of those voters where they're available for purposes of accommodating political parties. If you have regard to the table, it is notable that a significant number have registered since 2003. Am I correct?
Yes, Justice Kampepe, but you must...
And of the voters who have registered subsequent to 2003, there were no addresses which were captured of those voters. Now, I cannot understand why there has been no concerted attempt on the part of the IEC to attain addresses over the following 13 years. How is that possible? Can you explain it to me?
Yes, Justice Kampepe. These are people who don't have addresses. These people don't have addresses.
And
remember,
in order to ensure that the integrity of the elections are maintained, is there anything anywhere else which explains how the IEC was able to be satisfied that they are ordinarily resident in the voting districts in which they registered? No. If that should be a problem raised by the political parties, how would the IEC assist the political parties in that respect?
Justice Kampepe, these are, let me just recap. You'll see the total of these people is 7.8 million. And you'll remember that at the time the papers were filed, the numbers were broadly that there are 24 odd million voters registered altogether, of which about 8 million don't have addresses at all, and these are they. And then there were another 8 million who are people who have addresses, but their addresses are either incomplete or have not been properly recorded. So there were 16 million people in all for whom there were no or incomplete addresses. But of those people, and in relation to 8 million of them, the addresses simply had not been kept since the time of their registration, and for that reason was not on the voters' roll. But in relation to these people to which you refer, they are people who don't have addresses. They are people who come into the registration to the IEC and say, I don't have an address. I live in such and such an informal settlement next to the spaza shop under the water tower. Here on your map, that is where I live. And then the electoral officer says, show me on the map, and as long as the electoral officer is then satisfied that this person lives in the right voting district, they are then registered. But they don't have an address. There is nothing that one can put in the vote, that one can sensibly put in the voters' roll, because they were registered on the basis of a narrative and an explanation of where they live. And I don't understand our learned friends, for the respondents, to say that addresses must be disclosed for those people who do not have addresses, who merely satisfy the electoral officer by a narrative description that they live within a certain voting district. We all accept that there are 8 million people of that kind who do not have conventional addresses, who can only satisfy the IEC by a narrative description that they live in a particular voting district. And we don't understand our learned friends to contend that that narrative description must in some way be incorporated in the voters' roll. So they are the uncontroversial voters without addresses in the voters' roll. The controversial voters are those people who have addresses but whose addresses aren't there because they historically weren't kept. Thank you.
Mr. Trango, I'm sorry. You've been on your feet for almost 2 hours. Could I just sneak in two quick questions?
Certainly, Justice Chapman.
Can I take you to volume 3, page 268?
Can you tell me what document it is? Because my papers
it's the answering affidavit deposed to by the Chief Electoral Officer.
Page 268.
Of volume 3.
Yes, I have it.
At paragraph 24.2, it seems to me that the Chief Electoral Officer did not understand section 16 sub 3 to be imposing the obligation to seek and obtain addresses upon registration since December 2003. Because here he says, after 30 November, that is the date of delivery of the CAM judgment, the Commission has this obligation, which suggests that from December 2003 until November last year, the Commission did not understand 16 sub 3 as requiring it to ask for addresses, keep them, and provide them to political parties and candidates when elections are held.
In fact, just to add to my brother's question for further clarification, it seems to suggest that the requirement to record addresses never used to exist until the Constitutional Court made it a requirement. Correct.
Let me just make this clear. There are two questions there, and it's important to distinguish between them. The IEC says it has always known that it is necessary to obtain the address from an applicant for registration and to ensure that that address falls within the right voting district. So on the duty, that's the duty under Section 8.3 of the Electoral Act. On the process that has to be followed on registration, there has never been any doubt. It has always known what that duty is, and it says, in evidence which is substantially uncontradicted, that that has always been its general practice. What you referred to is the question whether it appreciated that since December 2003, you are required not merely to get the address for registration purposes, but that you are then required to keep that address and to put it on your system and give it to the political parties. That issue, you're quite correct, is not properly canvassed on the papers. They don't say, we realize that there was a duty to do so, and for that reason consistently did so since December 2003. But that issue, nobody has accused them of not keeping the addresses since that date. So that issue as to what their practice was since December 2003 is simply not canvassed on the papers and therefore unclear.
My question is premised on the statement on paragraph 24.2, which says, after 30 November, the Commission has an obligation. And as I understand it, it's the same obligation that is imposed by 16 sub 3.
Indeed, but that's an obligation to keep and disclose addresses. That's got nothing to do with the obligation to get the address at the time of registration to make sure that the person is correctly registered in the right voting district. And
I'm sorry, Mr. Trent, I'm sorry, my brother is still busy with you, but I'm saying it also brings in an unfortunate understanding of the judgment of this court, and that is the impression it inadvertently, and I use the word inadvertently deliberately, inadvertently suggests that before this court's judgment, there was no obligation to do that. It is this court that caused problems for the IEC. 16.3 never used to require the IEC to have addresses recorded. And that's unfortunate, because it's not this court that came up with that, it is the legislation itself.
Chief Justice, yes, you're right. The question how the IEC understood and applied that section is never squarely canvassed. What they do say is that after come, we jacked up our processes, we retrained our 51,000 election officers, we put out a new manual, we developed a new form to make sure that we comply with paragraph 5C of the come judgment. And you're quite correct on that score. But what was not canvassed, because it was not raised by either side, is, well, what did you do between December 2003 and the come judgment? That issue is just never canvassed. Justice Jafta, may I just say that what you mustn't infer from the paragraph that you've read is that the IEC was not fastidious in making sure that people were registered in the correct voting districts, because that issue is squarely addressed and canvassed and is substantially uncontradicted. And that evidence is quoted in our heads of argument from page 8 in paragraphs 21 and 22. So the fact that they might not have understood 16.3 doesn't imply that the registration was in any way
much better.
Deficient.
Yeah.
They might have been deficient in the duty to keep those addresses and put them in the voters' roll since December 2003.
My second question relates to the debate that we had earlier on with the Deputy Chief Justice about the understanding of the Electoral Court's judgment, the two paragraphs that you referred us to. And my question is, shouldn't really we understand those two paragraphs in the context of the facts of the case? In CAM, there were about 1,040 irregularly registered voters, which the IEC admitted were irregularly registered. Here again, we have a similar situation. The independent candidates raised an issue in respect of about 4,000 voters. The Commission itself says, I noted that about 4,500 voters may be affected by that. Of that, we have called upon 1,600 voters, given them notices because we have realized that they were registered at incorrect wards. We have called upon them to show cause why their names should not be removed from the roll, which suggests then that even here, on the facts of this case, there are some irregularities relating to about 1,600 voters, which the IEC itself says they were not supposed to have been registered, their names should be removed.
Justice Jafta, I'll have to check the facts because those are not how I understand them.
Okay.
Let me say this. My learned friend, Mr. Marcus, will deal with a suggestion that there was, in this case, voters who were irregularly registered. And I will leave that argument to him. I understood that suggestion to be made in relation to 500 voters and not 1,600, and I'm not sure whether you or I might be confusing the corrective steps they took pursuant to COM. But what I address, as opposed to my learned friend Mr. Marcus's address, what I address is the core of the case. The core of the case had nothing to do, or was not that voters had been irregularly registered. The core of the case was that there are 4,000 voters without addresses. And the argument was that if a voter is on the roll without an address, then his registration is invalid. And that is the argument that the Electoral Court accepted. That merely because the voter is on the roll without an address, COM says, according to the understanding of the Electoral Court, COM says those registrations are invalid and therefore should be removed from the roll. That was the ratio of the Electoral Court judgment.
I'm sorry. For the benefit of Mr. Marcus, can I take you to page 262 of the same volume, where the Chief Electoral Officer describes or defines the core complaint? (262), paragraph 7. He says the core complaint of the applicants is that the Commission has not furnished a voters' roll that complies with Section 16 sub 3 of the Electoral Act. In the result, charged the applicants, it has been impossible for them to verify whether the voters whose names appear on the certified voters' roll and are indeed ordinary residents in wards 1, 4, 11, 12, 18, and 20 of Clogwe, or that they are eligible to vote in those wards.
Yes.
So that's the core complaint.
Yes.
And the IEC, in its letter on page 286 of the same volume, at paragraph 8.10.5, says, after a thorough investigation, 1,601 of the 4,531 persons were confirmed to be located outside their voting districts.
Yes. Well, my learned friend will deal with that issue.
Okay.
But let me say that the paragraph that you read, as opposed to the paragraph that you read from the affidavit, makes the complaint as we understand it. It is a complaint that says there are people on the roll, 4,000 people on the roll, without addresses, and that's a violation of Section 16.3 that says you must give us their addresses. It doesn't say that that there was any other irregularity attaching to their registration. And that is, Justice Jafta, where we part company with our learned friends. Their case, upheld by the Electoral Court, is that where there is a name on the list without an address, then the registration is invalid. And that is so only if 16.3 means that the IEC was obliged to go back and find the addresses of the 18 million. It's only on that premise that one can make sense.
Sorry to interrupt you there, and I'm indebted to the Chief Justice. Mr. Trengo, I understand the ANC's argument that Mr. Marcus is going to present to say the COM order has to be interpreted in the light of the shenanigans. Therefore, those 4,500 addressless voters had to be followed up in the context of COM, and therefore there's no question in COM of disenfranchising people or going back to pre-2003 or even before 30 November last year.
No, indeed. And that is because COM found and accepted and conceded that there were irregular registrations. It triggers, of course, a conclusion not only that those people are ineligible to vote, but that the roll is unreliable and should be cleared. But that all
Sorry,
of that,
by supplying addresses.
By supplying addresses. But all of that flows from the fact that there were 27% of the new registrations were considered to be irregular registrations. That didn't flow merely from the fact that there were people on the roll without addresses. Indeed, in Come, there were no addresses on the roll whatsoever. But the court didn't say for that reason everybody on the roll has been unlawfully registered.
Well, Mr. Trengove, I need clarification on a few things. I think at least twice you have alluded to the entitlement by political parties to the voters' roll that has addresses. I wasn't too sure whether that is intended to suggest that, by the way, these are independent candidates and therefore not entitled to have access to this which the legislation specifically makes available or provides for in relation to political parties. Are independent candidates entitled, or do you take a particular position?
Chief Justice, may I give two answers to the same question? The first is this: I live in a world in which this court is always deemed to be right, and the presumption is irrebuttable. So that, yes,
even if it might be wrong.
Well, in my world, the court is never wrong. So, and certainly paragraph 5D of its Come order says that the section 16.3 also applies to municipal elections. If you were to ask me whether you should consider or reconsider that conclusion, then my submission would be, with the greatest of respect, that the conclusion was based on a premise that the section applies to municipal elections, and that the premise was never interrogated or consciously determined. But there are a variety of reasons why we submit that it doesn't. And may I just say that...
Shouldn't we leave it on the basis that a decision has been taken and nobody has appealed to this court against its own decision?
Certainly we would never... we would accept.
Shouldn't we leave it there? Because unless you really want to make a submission on it.
Now, let me in seriousness say this. We submit with the greatest of respect that the premise of that finding was not correct for a variety of reasons. Both Section 3 of the Electoral Act and Section 3 of the Municipal Electoral Act says that the Electoral Act only applies to national and provincial elections, generally speaking, and applies to municipal elections only if and to the extent that it is made applicable by the Municipal Act. Now, the first fact is that the Municipal Act never makes Section 16.3 and 4 applicable to municipal elections, so that on the face of it, the sections are not meant to apply to municipal elections.
The position is astounding.
May I?
We don't have to debate it now. It's totally astounding. The definition of voters' roll refers to the same definition as in the Elections Act, and it's clearly incorporated by implication. But we don't have to debate that. I mean, the matter is settled.
Yeah.
Your views may be interesting, but I think the matter is settled.
Well, then I have no further submissions to make.
Let me move on to the next question. I'm sorry I provoked you to say, to mention something but didn't allow you to go all the way. The mistake is mine. I apologize to you, Mr. Trengove. Now, the available addresses or addresses available to the IEC. focusing only on the ordinary grammatical meaning of that phrase, do addresses or physical addresses become available to the IEC at the time of registration, or even if they are availed to the IEC at the time of registration, should 16.3 be understood to mean that they may well be made available to you, but if you choose to push them aside or burn them so that they are no longer available to you, then when political parties come and say, give us the national voters roll that has physical addresses, it then becomes open to the IEC to say, you know what? If you care to know, when they register, they gave me the addresses, but I didn't need them. So they are not available to me. I can't give you the national voters roll that has physical addresses because I chose not to record them. So I'm seeking to understand, is it for the IEC to choose whether or not addresses are to be available, or should availability be understood within the context that there are many settlements in this country, some occasioned by poverty, and therefore people find themselves in a space where their homes are without addresses, and therefore, if you don't have a number, not even a street number, a street name, your address is not available to the IEC at the time of registration. And even if the IEC were to come back to you later, your address would still be unavailable to the IEC because you simply don't have a verifiable a verifiable address in the sense that there is no number or street name. What does it mean?
Chief Justice, we submit with respect that it says one thing expressly and it implies a second thing. The thing that it says expressly is you must disclose the addresses where available. And we submit where available there means. It says where available, yes. And we submit that where available there means if you have them. We accept that it also implies that you must from now on keep all the addresses given to you. But it doesn't say or imply that you must find the addresses, even if you, the historic addresses, even if you no longer have them.
If as at, well, from, with a fact from December 2003, you are the IEC, here is section 16.3. It says, you know what, when political parties approach you and they want the national voters roll, give them the address, I beg your pardon, the roll that reflects addresses where available. As you register potential voters since the coming into operation of the amendment, is it open, is it to be understood to ever be open to the IEC to say, you're giving me the address, well, I'm not going to record it. And if that were to be the attitude, how then would addresses ever be available if the IEC were not required to record them?
No, Chief Justice, you're quite correct. We submit that since the enactment of 16.3, there's a duty on the IEC, an implied duty on the IEC, to keep the addresses given to it on registration. And that was the duty that this court's order recognized in paragraph 5C. It's precisely that duty. But in conformity with the order, we submit that that is a duty to keep the addresses given to you on registration. That's what the order says, and we submit with the greatest of respect. That order accords with the proper understanding, proper interpretation of 16.3. It does not say or imply that you must also go back and find the addresses of the people already on the roll.
5D reads of the order, it is declared that in all future municipal elections or by-elections, the Electoral Commission is obliged, in terms of Section 16.3 of the Electoral Act 73 of 1998, to provide all candidates in municipal elections on the date on which they are certified with a copy of the segment of the National Voters Roll to be used in that ward, in that election, including the addresses of all voters where these addresses are available. What obligation does 5D impose on the IEC in relation to the addresses? Is it to ensure that since 16.3 apparently requires, just to accommodate your viewpoint, apparently requires of the IEC to have recorded physical addresses since December 2003. Going forward, in the elections to come, the IEC would be expected to have complied with 16.3, or what does it mean?
No, it means exactly that, and you're quite correct.
Yes.
What it means is you must disclose all the addresses where available. We submit where available mean all the addresses you have, and that must be read together with the implication that from December 2003 you must keep all the addresses given to you, so that we accept that that duty includes a duty to disclose the addresses of all those people who registered from December 2003.
Now, purely on the basis that there is a need to avoid any further embarrassment by the IEC. I mean, the IEC has maintained an admirable credibility, I think, over the years.
Yeah.
Just to avoid giving anybody a reason to question the effectiveness of the IEC and its capability to discharge its constitutional mandate properly. Does 5D not impose an obligation also on the IEC to go back so far as practicable and check in relation to all other?
No, with respect, Chief Justice, COM simply didn't consider that question.
Yes.
It didn't consider, it's simply that where available in 5D correctly recites the language of the section of 16.3, and it is absolutely correct as far as it goes. What COM never considered is what that means. We accept, so that COM doesn't guide us on the meaning of that language. We accept that it means at least that the IEC must, since December 2003, have kept all the addresses of new registrations, and that those addresses have to be disclosed under 16.3. The question that COM doesn't answer is whether the IEC was also obliged to go back and find the addresses of the 18 million who were already on the roll in December 2003. And frankly,
after those who were enrolled after December 2003,
no.
What do you understand? Does it require? Does 5D require of the IEC to make sure that those are properly registered?
I'm not sure that that is what 5D says, but we accept that the duty under 5D is a duty that must be read with the implication arising from 16.3, that all the addresses must be kept from December 2003. So 16.3 and 5D read together both say that you must disclose all the addresses of all the voters that you have, and you must at least have those addresses of voters who registered since December 2003. That much we accept.
On the assumption that the IEC is expected as a time of the certification of the National Voters Roll to reflect known addresses, and dealing with a question that it's a near impossible task to accomplish, what is to be done? What can be done? Maybe we should start there.
It depends on what you mean by known addresses, because they already reflect all the addresses now known to the IEC.
Let me give an example then.
But if you mean addresses disclosed to them in 1999, which they have since then lost, then that's a different issue.
No, that's not what I mean. This is what I mean. Maybe my first question should be prefaced with another question. How long does it take that South Africa to conduct a census? Generally, do you have an idea? Is it a year? Is it 6 months?
It's a question of months, but I'm not sure how long.
And as I understand it, Stats SA, according to the papers before us, is one of the agencies in a committee roped in, I think by the minister, to help track down the addresses of those who are registered without addresses.
I would imagine.
That's my understanding of the papers before us. Now, if Stats SA is able to do this within months and is available and willing to assist the IEC, why does the IEC need 4 years to accomplish the same task?
Chief Justice, let me say, I can merely tell you what the IEC says, why it would take them so long. I don't understand Stats SA to have a reliable list of addresses of everybody. In fact, one knows that they do their population counts often on aerial photographs and extrapolations of samples. So the suggestion that they have a reliable list of addresses of everybody in the country is not accepted by my client.
I don't know how I wanted to know whether they do it in months, because I know they do visit us in our homes. They even ask you about your salary. So I wanted to find out if they can do that within months. Yes, they interviewed me several times. If they can do that within months, and we're trying to make sure, all of us, I believe, that the elections proceed as planned, so far as possible.
Yes.
If they can assist the process, and this thing can be accomplished within months, does it not then create a possibility that what we thought could only be done after 4 years might be done much earlier?
Chief Justice, my clients who are the experts in this area say no, and they in fact deal with it in two places. They deal with it in their founding affidavit from page 428 in paragraphs 74 and 75.
I've seen that.
But the more interesting part, because is in the reply, where they also address where they also deal with the criticism of their prognostication. In reply, they deal with it from page 897 in paragraphs 15 to 17. And let me just say this, that one thing that I understand from my client is that there's a correlation between time and money. And one can't simply say to them, do it more quickly, because more quickly requires more resources and it is more costly. So one would always have to strike a balance.
Because it may impact on the preparation for the elections, I suppose.
No, but indeed. And we all agreed that this is an important project, but you just had a little sample of these 2 weekends that they organized that cost hundreds of millions of rands. To imagine how much it will cost to recover the addresses of the outstanding 12 million people. So that we submit with respect that we have their best estimate of the time it will take them, and that is at least until 1919. If the court is not satisfied with that best estimate, then the only other alternative would be to make a let's see how we go order, which says take certain steps between now and the end of next year and report back, and we will monitor you as you go along. But what you can't do with respect is to make an order inconsistent with what they say is their best estimate of the best they can do. simply because we as lay people are critical of their assessment, because that may be ordering them to do something which they have said they can't do and which they may turn out to be unable to do.
Well, the bottom line is always this, though, Mr. Trengove. Whatever a party's position is, it remains the responsibility of that party to articulate its position clearly and fully in court, rather than give the court an incomplete story, and when the outcome is not favorable, to then give a fuller picture outside.
Yeah.
We need a fuller picture here, so that it can guide us as lay people to arrive at a correct decision.
I submit with respect, if you look at their paragraphs 15 to 17 of their reply, that that's exactly what they do. But if the court is not satisfied, or if there are further matters that the court wishes to interrogate, then by all means my client offers its full cooperation. What I submit would be irresponsible to do is simply to cut their estimate by half on the basis that they must, on some basis or other, achieve what they say is impossible.
Irresponsible from which side?
No. All I submit is one shouldn't arbitrarily depart from the estimate that they make.
Talking about responsibility, are you still urging us that we run the 2019 elections on what might be a defective voters' roll?
Yes.
Does the time extend beyond 2019?
They have said that their best estimate is that they will get all the addresses by the end of 1919, and that's why they have asked for time until June 2020.
What is the estimate in relation to the obvious obligation that sits in Section 16? What about addresses which they're obligated to keep and record from December 2003? How long will that take?
They have not.
Understand, and we're talking about historical role. Whether it is before us or not, we will decide. If it is before us, is one debate. If it is not, what probably will be in any event before us is certainly the duty from 2003. How long would they rectify that?
That issue is not canvassed on the papers, so it's not clear that those addresses aren't already on the roll anyway, or if they're not, how long it will take to get them. So, Deputy Chief Justice, I simply can't answer that question because that issue was never canvassed on the paper.
The calculation, you remember the question from my sister Justice Khampepe, of the 18 million much vaunted everywhere in the public space, includes registrations after 2003, doesn't it?
No.
No.
No. Those were the people who were already on the roll in 2003.
The roll by 2003?
Yes.
If we took the view that the WASA duty, in fact we haven't come, from December 2003, would the IC need any time to rectify the roll from 2003?
That issue is not canvassed on the papers, so we don't know whether the roll doesn't already include them, or if it doesn't, how long it would take to get them.
Well, you might have to get instructions on that, because the debate does drift in that way, Mr. Trengove. For instance...
Yes, I shall do so, but it would be an issue that would require careful consideration, because there's both a determination of what is lacking, if anything, and then an assessment of what it will require to supplement.
I'll show you what my difficulty is. If we were to take the view that there's no basis and reason for reopening the details currently recorded up to 2003, and that there was no such duty, assuming we go along with you on that, then the only question would be from December 2003. And suddenly the moratorium beyond 2019 takes a different picture. And that is why I am urging it upon you that you take instructions on the matter, and we might hear you.
No, certainly, Deputy Chief Justice. May I just say this, though, that was not the case made in the electoral court or on the papers in this court. It would be a new case, and I will certainly take those instructions, but that is not what this case has been about.
Mr. Trengrove, I mean, a bit of sophistry there. You see, in Kham, the decision is based on the obligation that pre-exists set by Parliament in Section 16(3) and 4. So we didn't create new law. Chief Justice made the point over and over again. We articulated a duty that pre-existed. So if we are going to deal with this section at all, we may very well hold that the duty was always there from 2003 December.
But that's uncontroversial, Deputy Chief Justice.
Yes, and the question is, then the IC would not need any time at all to remedy the voters' roll. Is that right?
No.
If the cut-off point is December 2003.
I'm afraid I can only say, as I've said before, that issue is not canvassed on the papers, and for that reason I don't know what the answer to that question is. My impression is that they did keep and record those addresses, but how fastidious they were, how thorough they were in doing so, I simply don't know, and I can't give you any assurances. So if your question is that if you postulate that they were not required to go back to find the addresses of those already on the roll in December 2003, but they were required to do so since then, and you ask me to what extent did they do so, and if not, to what extent, how much time do they need to complete that task, then I simply don't know, because those issues aren't canvassed.
It goes to the direct access application, so it would be helpful to hear your clients on that in reply, or they may seek leave to give us the facts in another way. Thanks.
I'll certainly ask the questions, Deputy Chief Justice.
Before we adjourn, because we're going to adjourn now, and this is for all counsel, we still have to hear 6 others, and it's already 12:30. So we may have to cut down on the lunch hour. Just check whether 30 minutes would be enough for lunch, and also what time can we break for lunch. We never used to adjourn for lunch in cases like this in the past until I was advised that not everybody can be without food. So reflect on that and let us know, and also if you could really narrow down on issues that each must deal with. We don't have to repeat what has been traversed before we come on to speak. Otherwise, the court will adjourn until just after 1:15.
As you heard there, they are taking a short break at the Constitutional Court this morning, hearing an application by the Independent Electoral Commission against an electoral court decision that the voters' roll should contain physical addresses. The IEC had previously warned that the decision could hold catastrophic consequences for the country. So the Constitutional Court hearing the IEC challenging the electoral court's judgment regarding that Cloakwe matter. The electoral court decided that the voters' roll should contain voters' addresses, and the IEC approached the Concourt last month after it was forced to postpone by elections in Potch.